Family Guy is a show whose DNA we're going to be picking out of the genre of animation for the next several decades. It's a show with so much influence that it just made me call animation a genre earlier when it's a medium. I'm sure a few people are already hastily backspacing a bunch of rants they've planned out because of that. But what I mean by that intentional mistake is that Family Guy was, for a few years, so influential on adult animation that people started calling every new animated TV sitcom with a target audience older than 13 a Family Guy clone, much in the same way that first-person shooters used to be called Doom clones. At the time, Family Guy was able to pull in numbers equal to what The Simpsons was getting during its golden age, and even then, a bit beyond that. Yet today, the show is more infamous for its decline than remembered for the peaks of its popularity. So, what caused this? Was it any of the usual suspects for long-running shows like staff turnover, internal politics, or just running out of ideas? Did society change to be less receptive to the show's writing style, or was it Family Guy itself that changed? Or was it just plain oversaturation, with the Family Guy clone starting to overtake the original? Ordinarily, I would try to slowly answer these questions over the course of a retrospective that would go episode by episode discussing plot and themes of each show, while slowly building up not to a conclusion, but to a point where there's enough evidence for anyone to draw their own. Except, well, Family Guy's over 400 episodes long, and it's still ongoing. It would probably take well over a year to actually review every single episode, and that would be a waste of time anyway. So this video will start off as a pretty typical retrospective structured around episodes, and then, in keeping with this organizational scheme, I will approach the later seasons not as a whole, but by reviewing the 10 best and 10 worst episodes as per a combination of viewer and critic reviews, as well as general public opinion that I gathered in the extremely unscientific way of making threads on a few different sites. Hopefully this sample size isn't too big of an issue, as I'm looking more for general trends and not specific episodes that manage to bring down the quality of the show as a whole just for existing. But I'm sure that once you get to that part of the video in a few hours or days, this video isn't meant to be watched in one sitting, you'll invariably come up with an example that I might have missed. Since more is better, feel free to mention whether you loved or hated an episode that I did not review. And one more thing before I begin. Family Guy is a show notorious for being crass and politically incorrect, and as such, contains violent acts, substance abuse, talking dogs, and various flavors of bigotry. I try to avoid talking around subjects in my videos, even if I do sanitize my language a bit to make a more consumable video, so you're not going to hear any censorship bleeps, nor will you hear a word like unalived. Anyway, let's see some of those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely. Pitch Pilot. Stewie is plotting on how to brainwash Lois with something he refers to as the device, though Lois confiscates this as she believes it's just a toy. He spends the rest of the episode trying to kill her for the device back, only for Lois to misinterpret these actions as typical baby stuff, before finally returning the toy after being threatened with a box of live grenades. Meanwhile, Peter goes to a stag party, promising Lois he won't drink while out, but he doesn't hold to this promise and returns home wasted enough to fall asleep on the kitchen table, then going to work and sleeping some more before getting fired. At Chris's behest, he goes on welfare only for a clerical error to give him 1,000 times more money than he was meant to receive. So Peter starts living large, spending as much of the money as possible before being guilted into returning it to its rightful owners, the taxpayers. His method of doing this is throwing the money out of a hot air balloon, for which he is arrested. During sentencing, Peter proves that he hasn't learned a thing, but Lois gives an impassioned speech about how he only did what he did for his family, to which the judge responds by deciding to jail the whole family. But Stewie uses the device to simply brainwash the judge, giving Peter back his old life. Seth MacFarlane started his career in animation at a very early age with comic submissions to a local magazine at the age of 9. He went on to study at the Rhode Island School of Design, getting a degree in animation. His thesis film, The Life of Larry, was submitted to Hanna-Barbera by one of his professors, getting him a job not for his animation but writing alone. I'm not going to be covering The Life of Larry or its later incarnation, Larry and Steve, as I want to keep this video's runtime short, but many of the gags in that cartoon and basic character designs would be carried over into Family Guy, most obviously the voices of Peter and Brian, as well as their personalities. Once at Hanna-Barbera, he was moved from project to project with little consistency, which is typical of animation studios of the era, though this did have the advantage of introducing MacFarlane to plenty of people, many of whom would go on to contribute to the later success of Family Guy. On the back of the success of King of the Hill, MacFarlane asked Fox executives if they would be interested in another animated pilot, and they offered him a $50,000 budget to produce what would later become Family Guy. It's probably worth mentioning that a typical episode of a primetime animation costs upward of $1 million, so this early pilot was made on a very low budget that largely consisted of MacFarlane himself pulling frequent all-nighters over the course of about 6 months. The animation was crude, but as MacFarlane had been given jobs for writing alone in the past, he focused on the humor above everything else, a gambit that paid off and gave Family Guy its first Fox run. Death has a shadow. Stewie is plotting on how to brainwash Lois with something he refers to as the device, though Lois confiscates this as she believes it's merely a toy. He spends the rest of the episode trying to kill her for the device back, only for Lois to misinterpret these actions as yada yada. It's the same plot as before, with a handful of small differences. For one, it's now Brian who accidentally gives Peter the suggestion to commit welfare fraud, and the other big plot beats that's changed, that Peter was throwing money over the Super Bowl, rather than downtown Quahog. There was also a minor subplot involving Meg receiving lip injections that faded out with time, but this was more of a gag to give the underdeveloped character some screen time and a few lines. This episode first aired following Super Bowl 33, meant to give a lead-in to the new program that would give it some early momentum in finding an audience. This is why Peter is at the Super Bowl specifically, and why these celebrity appearances are where they are. A few scenes get expanded, like an aftermath being shown for Peter's Super Bowl stunt and Peter keeping his loss of his job a secret from Lois a bit longer, making her rage later in the episode a bit more justified, so she comes across as less naggy. There's an old bit of advice that is carried over from animation studio to studio since the days of Merry Melodies, the old Bugs Bunny shorts. That being that any joke that can be done in live action should not be done in animation. Audiences watch cartoons because they lack realism, so leaning into that is what gives the entire story an extra layer of absurdity that can be used for humor, as it's done here, at least part of the time. Family Guy's humor is still not quite ironed out in this pilot between the two types of jokes it tells, those like the dad thermostat implant and the Kool-Aid man bursting through the courtroom walls, are opposed to one another between the realm of old sitcom homage and over-the-top pop culture parody, a push and pull that will continue for a few more seasons. I Never Met the Dead Man. Meg is trying to get one of her parents to teach her how to drive, but Peter's only willing to do it during commercial breaks of his favorite TV shows. Meg ends up failing her driving test because of Peter's lessons, only for Peter to be distracted watching TV through the windows of people's houses and crashing his car into a cable dish, taking out TV for the whole city. He blames Meg for the accident, promising to buy her a convertible if she goes along with it, which makes her an outcast at school. Meanwhile, Peter is not adapting well to the lack of TV, to the point of strapping a fake screen to his chest and pretending life is a reality TV show, which takes him to Meg's school, where she finally has enough of his antics and tells everyone the truth. Lois is able to talk down the angry mob, and Peter realizes the error of his ways, promising to spend every waking moment enjoying life rather than sitting in front of the television. Meanwhile, Stewie is working on a weather machine to destroy broccoli by causing a massive ice storm, and one of these storms winds up ruining a Bavarian festival Peter's attending with William Shatner. The two decide to walk home in the rain together, only for a worried Meg and Lois to hit them while searching. Peter ends up in the hospital in a full body cast with nothing to do but watch TV to kill time, which winds up getting him addicted enough for his exhausted family to relax again. Family Guy is not a show that parodies pop culture, but rather the societal interpretation of that pop culture, through the lens not of the television and the cutaways, but how it's remembered. The theme song laments the loss of good old-fashioned values, while alluding to several things that weren't real aspects of life, but cherry-picked symptoms of the good old days. Basically, men used to hold open doors for women, but they would also spank them when they walked through. TV only showed the first part of this, though, so it gave a skewed vision of the good old days as being better than they were. Peter is the type of person who views society through this pop culture lens to the point of addiction. He needs television to tell him what real life is like, instead of experiencing it for himself. Because he is dependent on the first thing, he quickly becomes dependent on the second as soon as he's cut off, replacing his TV dependence because he can't entertain himself. Brian even mentions that everyone in the family has a hobby except for him, so it's not a surprise he would overreact to losing TV. Chitty Chitty Death Bang. Stewie's first birthday is coming up, and Lois has already booked a venue months in advance as she doesn't want to miss anything due to preparing for the party. But while Peter's dropping off the deposit, he gets into a fight with the kid and loses the reservation. Lois is furious as it will be impossible to plan the party on short notice, but Peter rushes around to organize as much as possible, to the point of stealing a parade. Meanwhile, Meg is worried she doesn't have enough friends until she meets the neurotic Jennifer, who invites her to a party that Saturday that's revealed to everyone but Meg to be a cult meeting. Peter lets her go to this party in spite of it occurring on Stewie's birthday, which annoys Lois as the family won't be together anymore. When Peter realizes this, he rushes to Meg's party to convince her to come back, not for Stewie's sake, but for Lois's, though the leader of the cult is furious that his mass suicide was thwarted, so he sets out to get revenge on Meg. But as he enters the Griffin's house, he gets trapped by Stewie, who spent the episode believing a man in white, the doctor attending Lois's birth, is trying to put him back in the womb. As the cult leader was wearing white robes, Stewie traps and eviscerates him, saving the partygoers as the episode has a happy ending. It's very common in sitcoms for drama to occur through big gestures, an elevated form of reality that makes the messages far more blunt than any other work might have them be. Arguments are not over minor things, they're always over big things. Lois can't yell at Peter for not helping with Stewie's birthday party. He has to ruin all her plans and then lie about it. Likewise, these arguments are not solved by sitting down and being honest with one another like boring normal people, but solved by making equally grand gestures like stealing a parade to bring to your son's birthday party. Except just as pop culture often portrays such events as being larger than life to the point where we start internalizing messages about events that do not reflect reality, Peter has also internalized these grand gestures, and because Family Guy is the show that is self-aware about its genre, this doesn't work. It's not the parade or the scale of the party Lois ever wanted, but the time with her family. He's able to make a happy ending by picking up his daughter from a party, far less effort than his other schemes, even if the episode then has this party be a cult meeting. Just because the message eschews the typical genre morals doesn't mean the episode won't still contain the flavor. Mind over murder. Peter goes drinking with his friends while Lois keeps the house clean while taking care of a teething Stewie, eventually asking Peter to take Chris to a soccer game where he gets drunk and fights another parent, knocking her out as he thought she was a man. He gets put on house arrest, moping about not being able to go out with the guys until he gets the idea to build a bar in his basement so they will come to him. Lois is furious her house has become a bar that she has to clean up, so she refuses to do any of the work. But when she sees her piano in the basement, she starts to play it while singing, living out her fantasy of being a performer while Peter is stuck manning the bar and watching other men ogle his wife. Soon Peter gets accosted by the woman from before and many of the other wives of Quahog, mad that their husbands are spending time at Peter's house rather than with them. So Peter has them come over to bring the men home, only for the woman to be moved by Lois's side of the story and resolving to stay. But when Quagmire accidentally lights the bar on fire and Peter's too busy arguing to notice, they all get trapped in the inferno where Peter promises to be a better husband. Meanwhile, Stewie is trying to build a time machine to skip over his teething pains, only for Lois to show his schematics on stage. So he builds a reverse time machine instead, undoing him ever having written down his plans, but also reversing time to before Peter dropped off Chris at his soccer game and then injuring his foot so he can't help out or kick off the plot. TV antics are already exaggerated versions of real-life events, and Family Guy's a show that takes this disparity and then goes another step further. TV sitcom fathers tend to be lazy and a bit unreceptive to their spouse's problems. Peter Griffin is downright neglectful, if not actively misinterpreting Lois's visual exhaustion as joy. But what's also egregious in the world of television is the strict adherence to the status quo. No matter what happens in the episode, the status quo is always maintained, to the point where any change to the cast or dynamic is made a big deal out of. So in Family Guy, this too becomes extreme, where Peter promises to change not out of a desire to patch things up with his wife, but because they're about to die in a fire. And then the plot gets reset to its beginning with a literal time machine. The characters being such absurd stereotypes, it would have to be unrealistic for anything short of time travel to take things back to how they were. Again, Family Guy is very self-aware, so I feel as though the sci-fi plot device doesn't actually harm the narrative. A hero sits next door. Peter accidentally injures the new ringer hired for the company's softball team and needs to find a replacement or he'll be fired. A new family moves in next door, the Swansons, and Lois tries to get Peter to meet them, something he only agrees to when he learns the father, Joe, was a baseball star in high school. Meg tries to get the Swanson boy Kevin to notice her as Stewie confuses Joe for a cyborg and wants to steal his wheelchair. Peter convinces Joe to play only for Joe to arrive at the game in a wheelchair. In spite of this, he still performs well. Too well, as he becomes the star player and all the guys love him, heading home to his house for a barbecue and hearing stories about his time on the force. Peter gets jealous and decides he's going to risk his life for his family too, finding a bank robbery on the police scanner and heading out to stop it. Despite the odds, he succeeds, but when he realizes his family didn't see the incident, he holds everyone hostage himself to get credit. Once the news reports on this, Joe arrives and negotiates the release of everyone, with Peter accepting that he should be fine with whatever recognition he gets around the house. At the end of the episode, Peter is told by his family that there's a ton of little things he does that they look up to him for, and then they largely list annoyances like being controlling of what's on TV or eating the last bits of food so no one else gets any. This is a tongue-in-cheek way of acknowledging that Peter's not really a good father, but he's a character in a TV show and therefore must have a happy ending, no matter how little the ending is deserved. Family Guy is a show that parodies many other sitcoms not simply by making pop culture references, but by referencing entire plot structures, and then holding fast to those structures regardless of whether any of these plot beats are earned. This can come across as lazy, but the fact that it's happening in a show that's so surrounded by old TV shows makes it seem more intentional, as though they are laughing with the audience, rather than being laughed at. The sun also draws. Chris gets kicked out of the Scouts due to not wanting to be there, as he prefers drawing instead. When Peter finds out his son is not going to be in the group anymore, he decides to go to the organization's headquarters in New York, with Brian staying home and getting addicted to watching one day at a time. Along the way, the family stops for a bathroom break in an Indian casino, where Stewie heckles the entertainment as Lois gambles away the family car. But Peter learns that every member of the tribe is entitled to a share of the casino's profits, so he claims to be an Indian to get some money to get home. The casino owners don't buy the story, so they send him on a fake vision quest into the woods, with Chris going along so he can confess to Peter that he doesn't actually want to be in the Scouts. Peter winds up actually having a vision, talking to trees and then having the fawns become his spirit guide, and when he returns to the casino, the owners are impressed, as even they couldn't manage that sort of vision. Family Guy is a fast-paced show, with the scenes in between pop culture references being brief but almost all full of exposition or character change. Rarely is a topic deliberated on, they just set up action followed by another scene to set up the one following that. That half the runtime of each episode is dedicated to miscellaneous cutaways and jokes that are related to the plot but don't progress it actually makes this aspect of the show stand out even more. It's as if 22 minutes of plot are compressed into about 10, and 22 minutes of jokes are as well. The cutaway aspect of Family Guy is also what allows for this style of humor, where they can make a joke without worrying about continuity or even realism. The audience won't question why Peter goes around robbing Little Red Riding Hood of her food, then starves when faced with a real survival situation, as it's established the cutaways are both canon and non-canon, until the narrative itself confirms either way. Of course, this comes at the cost of any sort of relatability to the jokes, as they aren't happening to the characters as we are intended to relate to them. Brian. Portrait of a Dog. The family is sweltering during a heat wave as they look for a way to cool down by buying a new air conditioner. Because they can't afford this, Peter gets the idea to enter Brian in a dog show. But Brian's offended by the suggestion as he finds that behavior to be degrading, though a gift of a new collar from Lois is enough to convince him to go anyway. But when Peter tries to get him to beg for a treat, he storms out, only to get arrested for being an unleashed dog. This drives more of a wedge between the two, with Peter making it worse by reminding Brian that he used to be a stray. After storming out, Brian is chased by the police for drinking from a human fountain and is ultimately brought to the pound, where he's told he'll be put down. Peter convinces the city to review the case, so Brian prepares his plea, only for the city to refuse to listen to a dog. Peter then steps in and says that he and the city of Quahog ought to treat Brian like more of a person and less of a pet, and they ultimately agree, after being bribed, that he should have the same rights as the rest of the people, both in and out of the house. This episode is somewhat of an inevitability to be made when the cast features a talking animal like Brian. He is simultaneously one of the family members while still having a handful of unquestionably dog-like tendencies. As such, Brian Griffin is in a state of limbo, being allowed to be a freeloader, or at least a non-breadwinning adult, so a pet, but still exercising freedom as though he were paying his own rent. Reaffirming his relationship with Peter and the rest of the family in this episode is what establishes why he is tolerated by the characters. As to the audience, he is accepted through his sarcastic additions as a straight man to Peter's jokes, itself a holdover from the days of Larry and Steve. And then this whole relationship is put into the larger moral context of treating a person like a second-class citizen, tolerated but only under certain behavioral conditions. Brian begins to behave the way people assume he's going to behave, only to be punished anyway, a prisoner in either a literal or spiritual sense. The only way he can get a sense of justice is when those around him treat him with dignity first, rather than believing in some vague notion of earning it. Peter, Caviar Eater. Lois's Aunt Margaret visits Quahog, prompting discussion about how Lois and Peter first met. She was the heiress to a wealthy family, and he was a towel boy at a club. But when Margaret dies and leaves her summer home to the Griffins, Peter decides to retain all the waitstaff and other nice amenities by selling their old home in Quahog, as he wanted to finally provide the nice things Lois walked away from when she married him. Despite the wealth, Peter still struggles to fit in with the rest of high society, so he asks Brian to teach him how to fake class. The new Peter debuts at a charity auction and starts saying fancy-sounding phrases before purchasing an antique vase for $100 million, far more than he has, and far more than even the house is worth. After failing to pass it off as a historical site, then later getting a Star Wars-inspired motivational speech from Brian, Peter reverts back to his old self and makes peace with Lois, accidentally discovering a secret stash of pornography featuring U.S. presidents, which is enough to convince the society that the house has historic value and they can buy back their old home. The first season of Family Guy was short, only a few episodes, and it never really explored character dynamics at all. The family was a family. The father acted fatherly, mother acted motherly, daughter daughterly, baby acted like a baby, at least according to the family, unaware of his homicidal tendencies. For lack of a better word, Family Guy was a generic show, to its benefit. The cast needed no introduction because you could just look at them and know what their deal was. Jokes didn't depend on prerequisite knowledge of their dynamics. A still image of the Griffins on the couch immediately informed you of who they were and what they were about. The second season is when these dynamics started to change. No longer is Peter just the goofy TV dad, he's got a backstory now and is shown to have won over Lois, who rejected the cushy life of luxury her family had for her to live with someone who knew how to have mindless fun. The kids are getting more personality, with episodes about rejecting the part of their lives they're not satisfied with for whatever the gimmick of the week is, as Peter is now showing that he is self-conscious about where he came from. Season 1 Peter was concerned with providing for his family, he committed welfare fraud to support them after all, but Season 2 is when Peter starts to do things more for himself to cover for his own character flaws. Holy crap. Peter's father, Francis, retires after 60 years working at a mill, though from his retirement speech, it's clear he resents being forced to stop working, something he did so much he never had time for Peter growing up. So Peter offers to let Francis stay at their house so they can catch up on father-son bonding time, though Francis does little more than insulting the others and telling them everything they do is a sin. It's not until Peter remembers how obsessed the man was with work and religion that he gets the idea to get Francis a job at the toy factory, something that quickly propels him to a management position where Peter's father is able to run the factory like a sweatshop. When Peter tries to stand up to the old man, he gets fired, and while moping around in unemployment, he sees that the Pope is in town and hatches a scheme to kidnap him. Peter steals the Pope-mobile and takes him to Quahog, where the Pope tells Peter that he has a good family and ought to be proud. Then, when the Pope visits Peter and Francis at work, Francis gets angry at the Pope for not being Catholic enough. The Pope then says that the two should still love each other even if they don't like each other, which is good enough for Peter as Francis leaves the toy factory to get a job as Pope's security. Family Guy's a show about a family guy. Those phrases are different because of capitalization. It is deterministically a show about a family guy, to the point that it must be a show about a guy with a family or else. Peter loves his family to a fault, which is fine when they love him back, but not so much when the family has no interest in sharing those feelings. This is another aspect of the domestic comedy that Family Guy parodies, the fact that everyone has to love and accept each other in the end so the audience will be happy. Peter has seen the happily ever after ending play out so many times he assumes that's a default, but it doesn't need to be true. Just because someone's a member of your family doesn't mean you have to like them, but it still comes with an understanding that you and them are still at least connected. Peter loves his father as much as he is obligated to do so, that's to say equal to the amount of love he has received, because it's not like Francis hates his son, he's just has a weird sense of morality that makes him extremely judgmental. Da-boom. While out shopping for a New Year's party, Peter hears from a chicken man that Y2K is going to be the end of the world. So he stocks up on emergency goods and forces the family to spend New Year's Eve in the basement rather than at Quagmire's party. This saves them from a nuclear launch, with the rest of the neighborhood being mutated or killed. But when Peter accidentally eats all the dehydrated food, they have to set out to find more, coming upon a Twinkie factory that survived the blast and rebuilding civilization around it. Peter names the town New Quahog and becomes its mayor by default. But between randomly assigning jobs to people instead of using their expertise and melting down all the irrigation pipes for firearms, New Quahog soon falls into chaos. Peter and his family are banished and they walk into the sunset. Meanwhile, Stewie has been mutating more and more into an octopus, laying hundreds of eggs which hatch into tiny Stewies that then overrun the town just after the Griffins left. In the end, it's revealed that it was all a dream, just like in the show Dallas, and that nothing really mattered. You're probably pointing out now that a few minutes of this episode's runtime were dedicated to the first chicken fight, a long-running gag in Family Guy where Peter fights a giant chicken in an increasingly elaborate fashion before returning to the episode. The show has had cutaway gags in the past, but this running gag is a joke not only in its irrelevance, but the fact that it goes on for so long without a conclusion. In a way, it's sort of setting up the episode's ending. Everything was the dream of a woman from Dallas, so it didn't really matter, much like the 2 seasons of that show where JR was dead only for his actor to come back and the whole ordeal was retconned out of existence. And of course, it is a sitcom parody, so everything resetting at the end of the episode is basically a given anyway. It's just a matter of rebuilding the show after a literal apocalypse, and a dream sequence is a way to explain away this aspect that the audience is already primed to believe. Also primed to believe that everything has a quick fix is Peter, who has seen enough pop culture to know that an untenable position can be undone by just saying it's a dream. Obviously, a move like this shows a lack of respect to the audience, at least the portion of the audience who is expecting some sort of coherent narrative in an animated sitcom. I'm not saying it can't be done, not even that it can't be done well, just that it's not the expectation of the genre, nor is it a goal that the showrunners ever intended to have. Which is why such a cop-out non-ending isn't jarring. It breaks believability, but so did everything that came before it. Brian in love. The family finds a urine stain on the carpet and they all blame Stewie, with Peter taking this as an opportunity to begin potty training him, though Stewie does not take kindly to this. Eventually Stewie learns the truth. It's Brian who's been peeing on the carpet, and when he has an accident in public, the rest of the family learns of this too. Brian gets sent to therapy, where it is suggested that his urination is a psychological response to his midlife crisis. But after he has another accident, which is actually Stewie this time, seeking revenge for being blamed before, Brian gets asked by his therapist if there's a feeling of unrequited love. Stewie finds this out after watching a failed attempt at flirting and starts taunting Brian, who then confesses to Lois only to be told not to try to change their relationship. In the end, he and Peter play a round of golf, as Brian is content he's moved on. Brian's urinary troubles are shown to be the result of his midlife crisis during this episode, cured when he begins to travel the world and sees its sights before returning home. He believes himself not to be cured when Stewie starts urinating all over the living room to blame him, meaning the second attempt at curing himself is based on a false pretense. This is why, even though he doesn't have his proposal accepted by Lois, he's still happy because it wasn't really about her. He was genuinely cured and only believed himself to have continued troubles. So when he believes himself cured, that is all it takes. Of course, the Brian and Lois crush would be developed later in the show as an underlying part of the dog's character for several seasons, an unrequited love that is as tragic as it is unfounded. Lois has been shown to love Peter specifically because he is a down-to-earth and lowbrow individual. His antics are a liberation from her restrictive and conservative upbringing. Brian, by comparison, is a stuffy intellectual type, or at least pretends to be one, and so he has none of what Lois is looking for in a man. It is also likely a relationship built on proximity. He and Lois live in the same house, and we've seen that Brian doesn't get out as much as he should. So once more, getting out and seeing the world is what it took to get over himself. Love thy trophy. Meg wants a new bag, but Peter won't buy it for her. So she starts working at a local pancake house, getting a job because the owners believe she's an unwed teenage mother and Stewie is her son. She leans into this misunderstanding, pretending Stewie is addicted to drugs so people will leave her bigger tips until she can afford the bag. Meanwhile, the rest of Spooner Street is working together on a parade float based on the scene from Who's the Boss, where Tony sees Angela in the shower, ultimately winning a golden clam trophy for their work. But when it comes time to take the trophy home, they all fight over who did the most work and gets to keep it. Ultimately, it's placed in the middle of the street on the repurposed float, where it then gets stolen. The neighbors all accuse each other of being the thief, bringing up past instances of misdeeds to justify their suspicions. These misdeeds are then told to a social worker who ate at Flappy's and heard Meg's crack baby story, using this as justification to bring Stewie into a foster home. Once they realize their argument has caused one of their neighbors to lose their child, the neighbors get together to plan a heist and steal Stewie back, but when they're caught they simply explain the situation, ultimately bribing the new family with Meg's new purse for Stewie back. The whole street comes together in this episode to achieve a common goal of winning the parade float contest, each person contributing their strengths to the project, then each person feeling as though their contribution was the most valuable one. This is why they all feud over the trophy in the middle of the episode, as they all felt themselves entitled to it. Then they begin to fight, using each person's history of law-breaking as justification for why they might steal the trophy, ignoring the real reason of believing they deserve it more. The reason they don't look at it this way is because they all share that motivation, so to claim as such is admitting they were at least thinking about taking the trophy for themselves. It's not until the end of the episode where they mirror the beginning, everyone working together to save Stewie from a foster home. And Stewie is in a foster home because of the events of Meg's A-plot, a plot with the similar theme to it where people all assume the worst-case scenario about her. In this case, Meg allowed people to assume she was in a bad situation and simply didn't correct the misinformation, allowing people to exploit themselves for her profit. During the other plotline, the people of Spooner Street all start exaggerating terrible stories about each other and jumping to conclusions based on these lies. They wound up letting the foster system take something valuable away from them, as their priorities did not lie in stopping this. Death is the B word. Peter has a cancer scare and starts worrying that he hasn't lived a good enough life, though when this scare turns into a false positive, he's able to relax until seeing the hospital bill and realizing it's too expensive. So he fakes his own death on the forms to get out of paying, only for Death himself, voiced by Norm Macdonald, to visit, saying it's Peter's time. Peter tries to run from his own death, literally, and the man trips, injuring his ankle. Death then stays with the Griffins for a while he heals, with Stewie pampering him because he looks up to the guy. But soon it's discovered by multiple people that Death is out of commission, and they can do whatever they want and not die. So the streets become chaotic with people defying Death. Death needs to get things back in order, so he tells Peter he must take over and do his job to remind people of the natural order. But Peter is hesitant to actually kill anybody, especially when his next job is to crash a plane with the cast of Dawson's Creek on board. So he attempts to warn the pilots, killing them by mistake and risking a plane crash. But Karen Black happens to be aboard and she saves the day. In the end, the pilots dying was enough for people to realize Death's rules apply again, and Peter gets to keep his life. An episode that starts about Peter learning to appreciate his life ends with Peter learning to accept and appreciate death as well, going from trying to live every day to its fullest to just being grateful he's alive at all. His fear of death at the start of the episode is less of a fear of dying and more of a fear of what he's leaving behind, or rather what he is not leaving behind. Once Peter learns that Death is out of commission, he starts to do a bunch of risky behaviors and suffers deadly injuries. It's not that he was worried about his lack of accomplishments, but the more instantaneous death that leaves you behind mid-project. So it only looked like Peter had cured his phobia after the doctor's visit. The real lesson was learned on the airplane, seeing other people in the prime of their lives and realizing their potential is just like his. Plus a little joke about the Dawson's Creek child actors all being in their 20s. The king is dead. The director of the local community theater dies, and Lois is given his old job. She's excited to have something creative to do, which makes Peter grow jealous as his latest toy idea was rejected at work. So Peter auditions for the play The King and I. He doesn't make the cast, but Lois, in an attempt to cheer him up, puts him in charge of producing and selling all the tickets. Peter's means of selling more tickets is to attach the local celebrity, newscaster Diane Simmons, to play in Loretta's place. Lois walks out of her role in frustration when Peter keeps making more and more outlandish suggestions, like turning it into a kung fu action romp. Now in charge of directing, Peter starts changing more about the play, turning characters into aliens and ultimately giving himself the leading role as Anna, now part robot. The day of the play comes and the theater is sold out, with Lois showing up to watch it flop. But the audience loves it, giving the play a standing ovation, then another standing ovation when Peter farts. Lois realizes that creativity is creativity, even if it is lowbrow, and the couple resolves to make their next production a joint effort. Peter's attempts to modernize The King and I wind up creating a pop culture-obsessed piece of mindless entertainment that assumes the very worst about its audience's attention span and ability to deal with high-level themes, and the audience loves it. As it turns out, when you pander to the lowest common denominator winds up loving it, so Peter's able to be successful by pandering to himself, as his wants are closely aligned with the average person's. Is it highbrow? No. Is it good? Also no. But is it entertaining? Sure, why not? It's easy to draw a comparison between Peter's variation of The King and I and the show Family Guy itself. Family Guy has all the trappings of a typical animated sitcom, but differentiates itself by being crass and crude and yet very self-aware. It's not a smart show, but it isn't brazenly stupid either. It's a bit like taking a multiple-choice test and getting every single question wrong. You have to know all the right answers to get all of them wrong. Guessing randomly would have at least given you a few correct answers here and there. So this episode is a way for the showrunners to admit that the show is not high art, but still shows competency in its ability to catch attention and get people to watch more and more of it. Is it highbrow? No. But is it entertaining? Sure. Why not? I am Peter, hear me roar. Everybody on Spooner Street wins a free boat, except Peter, who took the mystery box and gets tickets to a comedy club. Upset over everyone else showing off their boats, Peter gets drunk at the club and goes on stage, embarrassing himself without realizing the audience is laughing at him instead of with him, then believing he's a comedic genius. When he tells a few sexist jokes at work, he's ordered by Gloria Ironbox to take a sensitivity training class, and when that isn't enough, Peter is sent to a women's retreat. Here he gets in touch with his feminine side, and upon returning acts more motherly towards his family. Lois is happy with this change as Peter's finally respecting her, but when he ceases to act like a man at all, she gets annoyed and asks Quagmire and Cleveland to get him to man up again. These efforts fail as well, until the family goes to a women's organization meeting and Lois meets Gloria, who insinuates that Peter's earlier behavior was due to Lois acting too weak. When Gloria insults Lois's children, the two get into a fight, though after falling into the pool, Peter's reminded of his sexuality and he rushes home with Lois, having reverted to his old self. It's not much of a secret that old TV reflected the values of its time, and that the values of its time are things that went away for a reason. Whether it's the overt misogyny of something like The Honeymooners, one of these days pow to the moon, or it's the more subtle misogyny that gets brought up in this episode, where Lois is meant to stay in the kitchen, raise the kids, and never live a life outside of taking care of her family. So Peter's internalized this because he's watched a lot of television, but this is a television that was made by people who grew up back when women in the workforce were a novelty instead of normal reality. So he is old-fashioned and expects a culture that hasn't been around for decades. This is why he clashes so much with women like Gloria, because she is a modern woman and he's an old-fashioned man. Or from another perspective, she's living in reality and he lives in fantasy. But the other side of femininity presented through Lois is also justified in this episode, where she explains that feminism is about choice, and if women are able to choose, then that means they can choose options other women might not agree with. So Lois's decision to live with Peter is justified not as a woman forced into a domestic role, but one who has actively sought this out. This tracks with her character. She rejected the life of wealth and luxury from her parents to live with him, so of course, she would choose the life. If I'm Dyin, I'm Lyin. Peter and Chris's favorite show, Gumble to Gumble, gets taken off the air, so Peter comes up with a scheme to pretend that Chris is dying to use a charity foundation's resources to bring the show back. This works, but only because the network bought the rights to Chris's tragic story in exchange, and after a few days of using Chris's disease to get out of all sorts of responsibilities, the network arrives demanding an update on the boy. Peter is pressured by Lois to reveal the truth, but knowing he's on the line for fraud if he does come clean, he instead claims he has healing powers and cured his son. The next day, a group of worshippers appears on the Griffin's front doorstep, singing praises of Peter, who immediately starts acting like a god. But the rest of the family warns that the real god won't be pleased with this development, and soon the house is stricken by plagues, including blood in the water, which gets Stewie to finally enjoy bath time. When the final plague is about to strike, death of the firstborn son, Peter finally repents, telling the worshippers that he was faking it all along. Chris gets to live, and everything goes back to normal. It's a little bit interesting to compare the relationship that Family Guy's early seasons have to religion compared to the overt atheist leanings it would be known for later. The first season, as early as the pilot, had religious-adjacent jokes, but these were less about taunting religious folks and more in-jokes that churchgoers would relate to. And here, God is directly blamed for the plagues that happened to Peter, and is even the character directly responsible for finally wrapping up the plot, when he agrees Peter learned his lesson. This is in part a pastiche of the shows that came before, when America was a much more religious culture, and this was reflected on the television we consumed. But it is also a product of the religiously justified morals that continue to persist in TV for decades afterwards, a legacy left by the Hays Code from the 30s that we're only somewhat recently starting to dissect. Running mates. Chris gets caught peeping in the girls' locker room, which gets him in trouble, though Peter resolves the problem by giving his son his old porno stash, except for a picture of Lois. Lois is running for school board president, mostly because she is concerned with the low quality of teachers being accepted to their schools, including a Mr. Fargus, one of Peter's favorite teachers from his school days. After Mr. Fargus has an outburst due to Peter throwing away his medicine, Lois's opponent drops out of the race and Lois runs unopposed. But when she says she's not going to give Mr. Fargus his old job back, Peter decides to run himself so he can rehire his favorite teacher. Due to Peter being wildly unqualified, he starts losing in the race, until he gets the idea to run attack ads on his wife using the picture he almost showed to Chris before. This makes Peter win, though when touring the changes he's made to the school, some reporters learn that a lot of the students are reading pornography they got from Chris. Peter prepares to save his political career by blaming Lois for giving Chris the magazines, but realizing how far he's dug himself, decides instead to resign from the school board. When parodying television, it's important not to merely stop the parody at the borders of pop culture, but to continue to peel apart the layers of all of what's on TV, and this means the news as well. Peter and Lois get into a fight over local politics where the qualified and dignified candidate of Lois is pitted against the populist but clueless candidate of Peter. Peter is able to play off the insecurities in the audience by using their fear of sexuality, and fear-mongering based on things that aren't happening, calling Lois a baby killer, then taking advantage of the fact that she, at this point, is refusing to stoop to his level. While Lois won't stoop to Peter's level, Peter will stoop to the level of the average voter, and this gives him an advantage. Just like in The King is Dead, Peter is able to become popular by talking to people on their own level, rather than coming across as a politician who talks down to people, even if it is done from a position of respect and authority. A picture is worth $1,000. The family goes to Bob's Funland for Peter's birthday, only to get met by the owner for their rowdy behavior, including Peter breaking his car's window. The owner of the park turns out to be a man Peter went to high school with, who points out he has a legacy and Peter doesn't. Later on, Chris cheers up Peter with an abstract painting he made that Peter puts in his car's window to patch up the hole, and it gets noticed by an art dealer who buys it for $5,000, then offers to teach Chris to be a great artist. But after getting a makeover and a new studio, Chris is told he has to cut Peter out of his life as Peter lacks culture and will stifle his creativity. So Peter decides to give his attention to Meg instead, hoping to use her bird-calling abilities to get famous, but this goes nowhere. Ultimately, the family arrives at the unveiling of Chris's newest piece, a series of portraits of Peter, which gets him kicked out of the art community, although it does repair their relationship. Peter tells his family he no longer cares if his name is famous or not, but then Stewie is scouted to be a Calvin Klein model. Family Guy is a low-brow show, and this is not meant as an insult. The showrunners are fully aware of the fact that their show's not meant to appeal to the high-culture crowd, and it's not going to be in the running for things that can be looked at as high art in the future. To say the least of it, it's mindless entertainment, but as long as both the creators and audience are aware of this fact, there's no foul. This episode is an attempt to justify this fact by arguing the two ideas are mutually exclusive. Chris is invited to become a big city intellectual to make high art for fancy people, and he has to reject his upbringing to do so. About half the episode is dedicated to showing off the various ways in which Peter does not fit in with New York society, being both a source of humor as well as a way to tie in the overall emotional beats that the episode wants. "15 minutes of shame." At Quahog's annual Clam Day, Peter loses his swimsuit during a performance and flashes the gathered crowd. Then he proceeds to embarrass Meg further when he meets Kevin on the way home. This escalates when each family member winds up doing something stupid at a sleepover Meg has later, so she decides to confront them about their annoying tendencies by going on a show hosted by Diane Simmons. But while on this show, their antics catch the attention of a producer who offers the family their own reality TV show, placing cameras around the house and showing their antics to the world. This only embarrasses Meg even further, and she eventually runs away to stay with their neighbors. Because Meg was the lowest rated member of the family, though, the executives are content with simply recasting her, kicking Meg out of the house permanently. But this new Meg is too popular, stealing attention away from Peter's antics and getting him and the family angry enough to walk out entirely, with the whole Griffin family being replaced as the original family stays in a motel, though at least they're together. The term dom-com is something that could describe Family Guy, but there's a balancing act that has to be done between the dom, domestic, and com, comedy aspects of the show. With too much focus on the family in Family Guy, there's little room for jokes as the sappy sentimentality will overtake everything else. With too much focus on the comedy, the basic premise of the show ceases to justify itself, and any real emotional beats they try to go for end up falling short. But even as early as the second season, we can see that the first of these two pitfalls is something Family Guy avoids by throwing itself full force into the second one. Meg is more or less the only normal member of the family at this point, in the sense that she reacts properly to everything that's going on, rather than with indifference or contribution. This episode then sees Meg replaced with a more ratings-friendly version of the character, that is to say, with a version of Meg that will make the family more of a comedy than the type of moral show the writers in the 80s tried to create. Peter's okay with this change, but only in theory. In practice, he soon learns that he, too, is not as ratings-friendly as he could have been and is replaced with a bigger celebrity while being shunted off to a motel. In the end, Meg and the others learn that family is more important than anything, even if you have to be a bit unsatisfied with your life to be around them. Later seasons will develop the family's relationship with Meg to make this position a bit less tenable, but for now the DNA of the older sitcoms is still present enough that this is the happy ending we get. A Road to Rhode Island. Peter and Lois buy a series of relationship-building tapes to help them better communicate, but Peter grows obsessed with the men's-only portion of these tapes as they are basically softcore porn, buying more and more of them until Lois tapes over one with a tease of her own to get Peter's attention. Meanwhile, Stewie is visiting Lois's family in Florida when Brian volunteers to pick him up as a means of distracting himself from his recently remembered abandonment issues. But Brian gets drunk in the airport, and when Stewie tries to drag him back to the plane, they find that their luggage and tickets are missing. So the duo winds up staying in a motel, then hot-wiring a card to escape after their card is declined. After crashing a crop duster Brian was hoping to use to get home, they wind up in the back of a truck, only to realize they're near Austin, Texas, Brian's birthplace. He's able to visit the farmer he was born under, where he learns that his mother is not only dead, but has been taxidermied as an end table. So Brian and Stewie steal the body to give her a proper burial before train-hopping home, ending their plot with one final musical number. It's no secret that Seth MacFarlane is a big fan of old musicals. From the big band opening of the show to the frequent musical numbers we've seen Family Guy get, the second it had the budget to start including them. Stewie and Brian take on the roles of Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, as even the musicality of the songs they sing is borrowed from the old Road 2 films made famous by that duo. And then to go even further, their road trip winds up having a significance to the characters that continues to define their later characterization. Brian and Stewie didn't interact too much outside of a handful of sarcastic quips between the two, with Brian being one of the few to recognize Stewie's homicidal tendencies, while also acknowledging his ineptitude. But this episode really starts off their relationship as vitriolic friends, hating each other's guts, but liking each other's company. The two will go on to have some of the most infamous and famous episodes of the next several seasons, and it all begins here, in the first of many Road 2 episodes to come. Let's go to the hop. After a plane crashes near Quahog with several toads on board escaping, toad licking becomes the newest craze at Meg's school. Peter and Lois learn of this when Meg brings home a toad, saying she was carrying it for the popular Connie D'Amico to try to be accepted. Peter hatches a plan to disguise himself as a student named Orlando Griffin, so he can find the source of the toad epidemic, and after doing a musical number that convinces the students to stop, he becomes the most popular kid in school. Meg latches on to his popularity, saying the two will be going to an upcoming dance together, but the fame goes to Peter's head and he takes Connie instead. Meg laments that her life is over, but Lois convinces her to go to the dance anyway, where Peter sees her in the audience as he's being crowned homecoming king. He confesses that he should have taken Meg to the dance instead of Connie and rides a motorcycle into the sunset, faking his own death as Meg is popular for a night. It is interesting to note just how much of American pop culture from the 80s revolved around high school and teen drama, as if that was the last time many people of the era felt as though they were really free before being thrust into working life and losing their wonder with the world. Peter gets the opportunity to relive his time in the setting of many pop cultural staples of the era in which he grew up. Only because the show is called Family Guy are the rose-tinted glasses of his memory becoming reality, and the students break into spontaneous song and dance routines with the same melodies as those from Grease, while Peter gets to become prom king just because he reenacted the best moments of the Fonz. But the problem with Peter refusing to grow up is that he starts to block Meg from doing so, getting in her way when all she wanted was a normal teenage experience. Peter's insistence on keeping his life based on his older experience means that culture never gets to move on to appeal to the next generation. Peter is holding on to a culture and never giving anyone else a turn, making Meg and her classmates into a lost generation, living in regurgitated Gen excrement, where the only culture remaining is drowned out by nostalgia for a time that never existed. Dammit Janet. As Stewie isn't getting along with the other kids, Lois decides to take him to a daycare. But with all the new free time she's found herself having, she gets bored and gets a part-time job as a flight attendant at Peter's behest, because he learned that the husbands of flight attendants get to fly for free. Lois hates her new job, but Peter is enjoying his time traveling the world, and he encourages her to stick with it as she wanted the excitement. But when Peter causes a scene on a flight where Lois is working, she pulls him into the bathroom to argue, and then the plane gets hijacked. Lois and Peter end up stranded in Cuba without passports, with Peter having to go to the black market to get them travel documents, though with no way to pay for these, they wind up on a raft in the ocean, smuggled back into the US, as they agree that Lois's life is plenty exciting. Back at Stewie's daycare, Stewie meets with a girl named Janet when she asks him for a cookie, and he falls in love, only to see Janet eating cookies with another boy later. He soon realizes that his love was false, as Janet was just hungry, and he tries to deal with the heartbreak. The role of woman within family-oriented pop culture has always been a background role. This is to say that when a show has a female lead, it gets advertised as such. If a show has a male lead, it's not commented on or acknowledged as abnormal. In other words, television is usually female-oriented or general audience. We see this frequently in Lois's characterization. She's defined not through her own traits, but in terms relative to everyone around her. Lois is Peter's wife. She's Chris, Meg, and Stewie's mother. She's the caretaker of the house. It would be weird to describe Peter as Lois's husband as though that were his primary character trait when he has so much going on, but for Lois it's not considered strange. The phenomenon of treating women like accessories continues into the B-plot of this episode, where Stewie has an extraordinarily one-sided relationship with the titular Janet. She only wants to spend time with Stewie because he has animal crackers, but this is something that he utterly fails to comprehend because he never once engages with her on her own level, simply bringing her around as he sings show tunes without really having any input from her. She gets viewed the same way Lois is, eye candy and/or property. When all you have to offer a woman is a material good, then she doesn't really like you as a human being. This is what causes Stewie to lose Janet. Not that he broke up with her, but the fact that they were never together in the first place. There's something about Paulie. Lois is complaining about how difficult it is to do errands without a car of her own, so she and Peter go to a used car lot to buy one, only for Peter to get a piece of junk because he didn't listen to Lois's suggestion. While lamenting about his beaten-up car to Cleveland, a man from the Mafia offers to steal Peter's new car so his insurance will pay out to have it replaced. But as Peter now owns a debt to the mob, he has to take Big Fat Paulie, the mob boss's nephew, out to the movies, and then the man refuses to stop following Peter around. Peter tries to get Paulie to stop spending time with him by saying that Lois forbids them to be together, so Paulie puts out a hit on the woman. When Peter learns of this, he asks to have the hit removed, only for Paulie to be gunned down before he can make the call. Peter then tracks down the hitman and receives an invitation to a mob wedding, where he'll be able to call off the hit himself. But the wedding is nearly called off when the bride and groom argue over the groom trying to work over their honeymoon with an assassination, and Peter convinces them to compromise, only for the hitman to realize his target Lois was there already. Peter volunteers to take the bullet for her, and his act moves the mob boss, who calls off the hit entirely. This episode is all about Peter never listening to Lois, itself a very plain plot point that many shows have had before and many shows will continue to have afterwards. It combines a lot of genre staples, marital disputes, problems solved with communication, and a tight moral that can play off the earlier issues. It's also about mafia hits, and a character's life being threatened by this lack of concise conversation. Because not only is Peter incapable of talking to Lois, seen in the purchase of the car, removal of the car, and introduction of Paulie, and so on, but he doesn't communicate his dislike of Paulie directly to the guy either. The problem with every character could have been solved by just telling the guy that he only had to do a single favor, but Peter's characterization stays consistently anti-conversation, just as in the many sitcom plots that came before. He's too sexy for his fat. Brian gets fleas, and they spread to the whole house, causing them to leave as it gets fumigated to stay in a hotel. But while at the hotel pool, Chris starts to get self-conscious about his weight, refusing to take off his shirt. So Peter tries to put him on an exercise routine as Lois puts him on a diet, with Stewie taunting Chris by eating extra, until Stewie himself gets an eating disorder and can't even lift his arms. Chris's diet fails to get him to lose any weight, so Cleveland suggests cosmetic surgery. Chris rejects this idea, but Peter gets liposuction and begins to enjoy his new skinny life in spite of the bad example he's setting. Later on, he gets even more cosmetic surgery, including facial implants, which Lois finds attractive, though morally repugnant. Made worse when Peter is invited to a beautiful people's club and tries to bring Chris along, only to leave him at the door when he is not allowed in. Later on, Peter can't stop looking at himself in his car's mirror, and he wrecks his vehicle into a lard plant, returning to his old, fat self. It's Fortnite Peter. That is all I know about Fortnite. Liposuction and cosmetic surgeries are viewed in this episode as the easy way out, to achieve a life goal without actually having to work for it. Except that life goal is the goal of being more attractive, which at first makes sense as a plot point as Peter is being lazy while Chris works hard. But after getting more and more implants to be more attractive, the lesson starts to get muddled. Facial genetics like Peter's are treated as though they are earned features, such as his weight, and the beautiful people's club he gets into is later treated like an award for those fortunate enough to be blessed. It's a very Calvinist perspective of the world, where God's favorite people are given nicer things by default, and morality is second to privileges bestowed at birth. But then all of this is placed into contrast to a plot point about work ethic. Worse, the moral of the episode, where Chris keeps working hard because of praise from Meg, then gets lessened by the rest of the show's 400 plus episodes where Chris is still fat. Peterbus Unum. All the guys on Spooner Street get tax refunds and buy nice things, making Peter jealous enough of Joe's new pool to get his own refund, only to get audited. So he tries to dig his own pool, only to hit a power line, cutting electricity to the whole street, then later learning he's not zoned to have a pool installed. He goes to Mayor Adam West to complain, where he learns that his house is technically not part of the country, so he declares himself the independent state of Pretoria. He walks around exploiting his diplomatic immunity to the city of Quahog, but later, when he's not being respected at a UN meeting, Peter hears from a few foreign dictators the only way to get respect is by invading another country. So Peter invades Joe's pool, claiming it as his territory, and the US responds to this invasion by placing sanctions on Pretoria, cutting off power and water. Peter tries to find comfort by embracing the world's various dictators, which makes Lois and the kids walk out on him. With no more women or children in the house, the US prepares to bomb his home, and Peter surrenders. The concept of keeping up with the Joneses is one where people buy things they don't need to impress their neighbors who have plenty of things they don't need to show off to their neighbors. It is such an old aspect of Western society that even Family Guy's predecessor, The Simpsons, began its run by making episodes about how played out this trope was. So when Family Guy makes an episode about Peter being jealous of the nice things all his neighbors have, they can't simply do the parody of the parody that's been done before. It has to be even more. The stakes have to be higher to an absurd degree, so Peter reacts to a zoning dispute and his neighbor getting a pool by declaring independence from the USA, then by openly becoming hostile to his neighbors. What began as a national pastime of passive-aggressive one-upsmanship becomes open war, showing the lengths some people are conditioned to go for in order to have a nicer house than the people next door. The story on page 1. The Griffin family visits Brown University for a college visit, but when meeting with the dean, he tells Meg that she needs more extracurriculars if she wants to get in. She tries to become a reporter for the school newspaper, but Neil says he'll only give her the position if she can break a good story. After some effort, she's able to interview Mayor Adam West, where she learns he's been spending taxpayer money investigating where water goes. Meg tries to get the story printed, but when she hands a copy to Brian and Peter, Peter says it's not interesting enough. So he goes behind her back to replace the story with one about how Luke Perry, Meg's favorite actor, is gay. Luke Perry sues Meg for publishing this, and she becomes an outcast at school, so Peter tries to save her career by getting compromising photos of Luke to prove his story is true. This culminates in him kidnapping Luke Perry and bringing him to the Griffin household, though when he meets Meg, he offers to give her an interview to clear up the misunderstanding. In the B-plot, Stewie laments being too short, so he brainwashes Chris to reach high places for him, only for the device to malfunction once Chris goes near a microwave. Peter, likely correctly, guesses that Meg's story about financial waste and scandal will not get the attention of a bunch of high schoolers, and does her a favor by replacing something boring but important with something irrelevant but attention-getting. Meg ends up in trouble for this story, but rather than trying to retract it to replace her article with something a bit more intellectual, Peter assumes that it's the lie that's causing trouble, rather than the sensationalism of that lie. This is why his solution is to take compromising stories of the celebrity in question rather than trying to save face, as though being a real journalist is about the answers to the questions rather than the questions being asked. This would be the position of a person who learns his moral lessons from television. Whatever's the most entertaining must be right, because that's what gets the most attention. Wasted talent. The Pawtucket Brewery is doing a Willy Wonka-style golden ticket scheme, giving brewery tours to anyone who gets one of their golden tickets. The whole town of Quahog is trying to get one of these tickets, to the point of Tom Tucker even lying about the final ticket being won for a better chance at victory. Peter wins the ticket and takes Brian on the tour with him, but when the two steal experimental fizzy beer, they get kicked out of the group. Meanwhile, Lois has been trying to win a piano competition, but none of her students are good enough, until Peter comes home from the tour completely wasted, and then he starts playing the piano perfectly. It's soon discovered that Peter is a piano savant, but only while he's drunk, so Lois keeps him in a permanently tipsy state to prepare for the contest. But on the day of the contest, they learn they're in a dry county on a Sunday, and they have to sneak into a high school party to drink, which makes Lois start to doubt whether she's doing the right thing. But she has Peter perform anyway, and they end up winning the competition with no one learning a lesson. Most of the time, Family Guy is a pastiche of the domestic comedy, using the existing beats we're aware of as the basis for its comedy, as it subverts what we are used to seeing, subversion being the very basis of comedy. Other times it uses a more straight parody of pop culture, taking either exact plot points or tropes and then showing them in the audience's light, but usually Family Guy is a show that does both of these things at once. This episode is a good example of this phenomenon, where the first half of the episode is a parody of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that takes full advantage of the audience's knowledge that it is a parody. Rather than the typical test of morality one is primed to expect, we see Joe kicked off of the tour for being disabled. Instead of Peter and Brian sneaking their way back onto the tour, he's kicked in the shin and thrown out, his later drunken ranting something the audience sympathizes with, as we were expecting that bit to go on longer. Though as it ties into the B-plot with Lois, we then transition back to what Family Guy also does well. Fore, father. After Stewie ruins several of Brian's favorite books for a craft project, Brian gets his revenge by convincing Stewie that his recent inoculations were actually mind control, and Stewie starts to believe it. Peter ruins the house while spring cleaning and is told to stay outside, where the rest of the men of Spooner Street are preparing for a camping trip. But while on this father-son camping trip, Chris is repeatedly compared to Kevin, who has much more work ethic and discipline than Chris does. To get him to man up, Peter tries to get Chris a job at the local driving range picking up balls. Chris is popular at this job as people enjoy hitting balls at him, but Peter does not notice this because he's interested instead on Cleveland Jr., a natural at the sport. Cleveland has tried to teach his son to play in the past, but as the kid is hyperactive, the lessons have never really gone anywhere. So to show off how good of a father he is, Peter starts giving golf lessons to Cleveland Jr., entering him into a tournament only for the kid's attention span to run out, proving Peter really couldn't get him to focus after all. As this is going on, Chris has been taken in by Quagmire and taken to a strip club. While here, Chris gets some advice from a stripper on how to get back his father's attention, and he returns to the driving range to make his peace with Peter. Peter gets so competitive with Joe over their respective fatherly abilities that he loses sight of the main deal of fathering, raising a kid. He ends up attached to another man's child as a means of proving something that doesn't have any real metrics attached to it. Peter is so obsessed with winning at being a parent that he starts attaching other competitions to parenting. If Cleveland Jr. wins the tournament, then Peter must be good at being a dad, all of this while neglecting his other 3 kids. What is not measurable is the job satisfaction that Chris has with what Peter got for him. Not only was Chris excited to show off his very first paycheck, but he even enjoyed the process of getting it. His taunting of the golfers and ability to drive more sales to the range, both things to be proud of and both things that Peter missed. Ironically, one of the earlier attempts Peter made at trying to get Chris to man up actually worked. He just couldn't put a value to this personal growth, so he missed it until the very end. The Thin White Line. During a therapy session, Brian is told that he should get into volunteer work to get out of the rut he's living in. This doesn't do much to help until he sees Joe and impresses him with his strong nose, so Joe gives him a spot on the police force as a drug dog. Brian finds life satisfaction from this new career, until he accidentally gets addicted to cocaine, soon sneaking away to find more and more chances to get high. After snapping at the Griffins, Brian finds himself in the middle of an intervention, where he finally decides to go to rehab. Peter recently won a week off of work in a competition, only to have to postpone the family's vacation due to Brian's stay in rehab, and after seeing how nice the center is, Peter decides to fake an addiction to stay with Brian as his roommate. But after Peter pressures Brian to skip therapy sessions to pull pranks on pregnant teenagers, the supervisor points out that Peter is Brian's biggest temptation, the person who drives him to be a worse person. After returning from rehab, Brian declares that he is going to leave the Griffin family, and he rides away in a taxi. Peter's antics are at once the cause of and solution to all of Brian's problems in this episode, with Peter getting Brian into all sorts of trouble while the relative worthlessness of this trouble is what he is running away from in the first place. Because most of these antics can be considered mindless fun, which is okay for most people, but to the mindful, like Brian, the mindlessness is more of a downside than the fun is an upside. So he spends time with Joe and the police force, hoping to do something good for the world and to give his existence some meaning that would not be there doing silly bits with the Griffin family. This is also the start of a two-parter episode ending with a to be continued, which shows a further commitment to the idea. Brian is unsatisfied with the humor-first condition of the show, and he needs to leave to be taken more seriously, just as Family Guy itself might have a character leave to be taken seriously as well. Brian Does Hollywood. Brian is trying to make it in LA, working miscellaneous odd jobs while trying to give his movie scripts to anyone who will see them. He sends a letter home to the Griffins, lying about his life in Hollywood while failing to find success in his writing career until his cousin Jasper sets him up with a directing gig. Meanwhile, the Griffins hear about Bill Cosby's show Kids Say the Darndest Things, and they want to put Stewie on the air, an arrangement Stewie agrees to as he thinks it will be a chance to hypnotize the whole country with one of his inventions. When Brian finds out the family's in LA, he invites them to the shoot of his upcoming movie, but once Brian actually shows up, he learns that it's a pornographic film, and he kicks the family out, hoping they'll just think that he's an egoist director rather than a smut peddler. Brian's later invited to the Woodies, an adult film awards show, and starts drinking at the bar due to not having anyone to share the accolade with. But then Peter and Lois show up, saying they're proud of him anyway, as Brian realizes that he was happier in mediocrity with his family than successful while lonely. Brian wanted his life to be more interesting, then he gets a job directing pornography, far from a typical, boring career path one could have. He gets to flex the creative muscles that he wanted to, he gets put in charge of something, and he even gets recognized for his efforts later on in an awards show that, although not as prestigious as he has hoped, is still better than what he had before. So this episode appears at a glance to have a message about Brian being ashamed of the direction his career has taken, at first because he was a writing success as he planned to be, and later because his directing career was too low-brow to brag about. But ultimately it has far less to do with his disappointment with his own career than it does with the potential disappointment the Griffins might express towards the failure. He doesn't care that he's directing porn, he cares that others might think less of him for doing so. When Lois and Peter show up at his award ceremony and congratulate him, he realizes the acceptance he was hoping to achieve was not acceptance from himself, but from other people, from the people closest to him. So Brian comes back to the Griffin family, content that he can find the thing missing in his life closer to home after all. Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington. Peter takes his family out to a baseball game, lying about an injury to get out of work. But when he encounters his boss, Mr. Weed, at the game, he gets in trouble. Before he can be punished, he learns the toy company has been bought out by a tobacco company, and his old boss has lost his job. This new company gives a bunch of perks to its employees in exchange for looking the other way when they advertise to children. But Lois and Brian convince Peter to confront his new bosses about their marketing, so they placate him by giving him the role of president. Peter and the Griffins enjoy their newfound wealth until Lois notices that Stewie has started smoking, and she urges Peter to do something about it. But Peter is busy partying with politicians as the tobacco company used him as an idiot who can talk to Congress on their level. Peter is about to convince the last few holdouts on an anti-smoking bill to switch to his side until he hears Stewie with a smoker's cough, and he changes his mind as well as Congress's, who then find the tobacco company out of business. This episode's plot is not too dissimilar to the pilot's, at least as far as Peter's motivations. He wants to provide for his family, and he wants to do it in a spectacular manner, so he becomes the president of a company that is actively seeking to harm people for their profits, going so far as to literally shoot at puppies in their first appearance, so as not to come across as at all sympathetic. What differentiates this episode is the introduction, where Peter gets yelled at by his boss for taking a day off of work without good reason. This causes him to feel a combination of weakness for not being able to do as he pleases at work, while also putting his ability to provide for his family at risk. so the first part of the episode sets up the second. Except, earlier episodes about the family's finances haven't really needed to do this. It's taken as an assumption that Peter wants more for them and more out of life, but after so many episodes of the show's setting and humor slowly drifting away from reality, we've gotten to the point where the generic 80s sitcom family is no longer so generic, and the showrunners have to remind the audience they're just like you and me. 1 If By Clam, 2 If By Sea. A hurricane blows into Quahog, destroying the Drunken Clam, Peter and Co.'s favorite tavern. As they sift through the wreckage, they learn that the pub has been sold to a new owner, Nigel Pinchley, who's converted it to a British-style pub. The men try to find a new place to drink, but when this is not successful, they instead plan on attacking the new bar by dumping the beer into the harbor. The men return home drunk the next morning, only to see a news report that the pub burned to the ground, getting arrested as they are the prime suspects. But the women of Spooner Street are suspicious of the conditions in which the pub was destroyed and investigate, using Pinchley's obsession with Lois as a distraction to get him to confess to insurance fraud. Also at this party is the unveiling of the new Eliza Pinchley, Nigel's daughter, whose accent so offended Stewie that he ran a My Fair Lady-style bet with Brian over whether he could fix her speech. In the end, Pinchley is sent back to Britain for an execution, and the now orphaned Eliza declares her plan to get revenge against Lois, much to the joy of Stewie. The difference between American comedy and British comedy comes down largely to whom the butt of the joke is. For British comedy, the punchline is more often than not at the expense of the comedian themselves, laughing at themselves and getting the audience to laugh with them. For Americans, the louder and more rambunctious option is taken, as with most things. Americans like to make other people the butt of their jokes, though this is not always done in such a negative way. We use humor to tell who our friends are, with comedy being a way of showing off closeness by pointing out where each person's line tends to be. It's not as though any of what I've said is an absolute statement, though. Americans will make fun of themselves as much as the Brits will charmingly tease a friend. But as a comedy, Family Guy often does not have the luxury of nuance, so a feud in comedic stylings here has an underlying animosity. How dare they think things are funny that we don't? And the Weiner Is. Peter is showing off the various ways in which he can compete against his son Chris and win, until they go to a sauna after a game of basketball, where Peter sees the size of Chris's genitals and grows jealous. He tries to find comfort from Lois, but when she assures him it's not a big deal, Peter doesn't listen, instead buying a phallic car and purchasing a new firearm. He then spends a lot of time with the National Gun Association, who have planned a camping trip that Peter invites Chris to. But while in the woods, they are attacked by a bear and Peter freezes up. But Chris is able to scare the bear off with something he learned on TV, and Peter realizes that he was wasting his time competing with Chris instead of cooperating with him. Meg has joined the Flag Girls at school to be more popular, but gets old meat thrown at her by the cheerleaders instead. At Lois's advice, she tries to kill them with kindness, and soon gets an invitation to Connie's Sweet 16 party. But while there, the popular kids plan more humiliations for Meg, who runs back to her mother in tears before Lois reveals her scheme to traumatize Connie by inviting over Quagmire. Peter starts to fear that his position as man of the house is threatened by Chris when he discovers the kid is bigger than he is. When losing this position, it also means that he won't be able to do many of the other things that the man of the house is supposed to do, namely keeping his family provided for and safe. Of course, this really comes down to a misappropriation of Peter's priorities. Being a good caretaker and provider is what makes you manly, but when looking down his son's pants, he instead sees symptoms rather than causes. Peter cares more about appearing manly than he does about actually being manly, the metrics overtaking the thing being measured. Meg spends this episode's plot seeking acceptance from people who don't want to accept her, going so far as changing her personality to laugh off their abuse in an attempt to get this acceptance. The issue with doing this is that it would no longer be Meg who they liked, but this masochist that Meg is pretending to be, and from their later pranks, we've seen that even this version of Meg isn't liked so much as tolerated. Lois's scheme to get even with the others is a more realistic version of their relationship, knowing that they won't like Meg, but the tolerance can at least be exploited for revenge. Death Lives. Quagmire gets Peter a tea time at a fancy golf course, only for Brian to point out the date in question is his anniversary. So to stall Lois, he sets up an elaborate scavenger hunt to make it appear like he has more planned while he plays golf. But on the course, it begins to rain and Peter gets struck by lightning, having an out-of-body experience and once again meeting Death, no longer voiced by Norm Macdonald. Death says that Peter will stay in purgatory until he has a revelation about his marriage, and the duo proceeds to go back in time to see the story of how Lois and Peter met. Mr. Pewterschmidt was not impressed by Peter and had him knocked out, then dropped into the ocean, where he gets rescued by Quagmire and the men of the Navy. There, Quagmire tried to get Peter to meet new woman, but Peter only cared about Lois, getting dropped off in the southern U.S., where he and Cleveland ride north, chased by the Klan. After all of this, Peter arrives back at Lois's father's house, where he's offered $1 million to never contact her again. Peter rejects this offer, making the Peter in the present realize that he used to be willing to pass on money for her, but now he won't even miss a game of golf. After Peter helps Death with his love life, Death gets Peter Frampton to play at the course as the final clue in the scavenger hunt, saving their marriage. Sitcoms love to use marital struggles as fuel for their plot lines to the point that it starts to become a bit ridiculous that the couples in question are even still married in the first place. Peter is willing to go through more effort to lie to his wife than it would have taken to reschedule a game of golf. This is all fixed by making it appear as though the neglect were intentional, that he was just throwing his wife off the trail to get her to where the real surprise was. The reason behind the troubles in the first place comes down to Peter getting used to his wife. When they were first dating and still in that honeymoon phase, he was willing to do far more for her. Now his efforts are expended towards spending less time with Lois, as he's forgotten the reasons they married in the first place. Not that the first few months of a relationship should be an excuse for the rest of the relationship's momentum. These things require constant work, not just a one-and-done deal. Lethal weapons. At Bonnie's recommendation, Lois takes a taijutsu class and quickly becomes the top student, just as Quahog is overrun with New York tourists there to see the leaves change color. As Peter is arguing with one of these New Yorkers, Lois steps in and beats up the guy, making Peter get the idea to bring Lois to his bar to fight off the tourists. But after fighting for a while, she beats up her instructor, then later starts making demands of Peter. But when Stewie attacks Peter as well, Lois starts to fear that she's now a bad influence on her children, and she takes him to a psychologist. There, it's not Stewie diagnosed with anything, but the rest of the Griffins, told they need to work out their anger issues with one another through exercises that they ignore to simply beat each other up instead. In the end, they sit around the TV, glad to finally be beyond that period of anger, though when Peter tries to blame TV networks for turning them violent, the budget is cut. What starts out as Lois being a natural at a martial art is soon revealed to be a manifestation of pent-up rage, which exists as a result of the many ways in which she's undermined at home with her family. Interestingly, though, Peter then sees her new aggressive self as a net gain, having her fight the battles he wishes he could fight but is unable to because he hasn't accepted his more aggressive tendencies yet. Peter feels like he lacks control as his town and his family's property are overrun by New Yorkers. So when Lois finally snaps, Peter is grateful because he wishes he could do the same. It's not until he starts getting pushed around himself that he begins to feel the same level of trapped Lois had before, and then he finally stands up for himself, not purely because Lois was emasculating him, but because all of society was. And while letting out this pent-up aggression is shown to be a good thing for the family, the fact that so much of this repression is there in the first place gets blamed on the violence shown on television, a complaint that gets the show's budget cut, itself a self-aware wink to the audience that Family Guy's not above its own criticisms. Because of the show's role as a parody of the TV of the past, this is a way of saying not that TV is influencing its audience, but that the art reflects its culture, and then this mirror is shown to the audience, and the culture is influenced in turn. The kiss scene round the world. Meg gets an internship at Channel 5 News in order to get closer to her crush, Tom Tucker. Unfortunately, a gross boy from her high school, Neil, has also taken this internship, and uses it as a chance to get closer to Meg. After a madman targeting members of the media takes a hostage, Neil and Meg are sent to investigate, only for the man to shoot at the copter they're in, making them fearful for their lives. Thinking they're about to die, the two kiss, and after they're saved by Hugh Downs, Neil then broadcasts the footage on television, thinking he and Meg are a couple. Meg sets the record straight by releasing her own report where she gets various people from around Quahog to insult the boy, only for him to climb onto the roof where they were before. Meg, thinking he's about to jump off, rushes over to apologize and even throws herself beneath him when he falls, saving his life. In the B-plot, Stewie gets his first tricycle only for it to be stolen by a bully, so Stewie gets his revenge by taking the bully captive, only for Lois to find the trike on her own. Another staple of the 80s sitcom is the nerdy dude who constantly tries to win over the affections of a girl from his class or workplace or neighborhood or whatever. He gets rejected, then tries again until at the end of the episode he is finally rewarded with some romantic gesture being returned, only to get wiped out when the continuity resets between episodes. In Family Guy, we see this all-too-common trope played out from the opposite perspective, and it's actually a little horrifying. So often we see a moral about being persistent in relationships to make them real, when you're much better served by figuring out why someone would say no in the first place and changing that. Or if it's not something worth changing, then abandoning the idea of a happily ever after with a person who doesn't like fundamental parts of who you are. The issue with Neil here is presented as a physical one. Characters comment on Neil being unattractive and thus unworthy of love, while joking Meg is the same way. But the problem with him is far less about his looks, though still a factor, but the fact that he's aggressively persistent. In other words, he doesn't take no for an answer. Relationships are supposed to have boundaries, and a person who refuses to acknowledge your boundaries is not just a bad partner, but a dangerous one. Neil being persistent undermines Meg's agency as a person, and in other words is a red flag for whether they could work out together, or if Neil could work as a partner with anyone at all. Mr. Saturday Night. After being made fun of at a career day at Chris's school, Peter is motivated by Lois to invite his boss over for dinner so he can be a bit more assertive in his career. The date of the dinner comes, and Mr. Weed is so impressed by Peter's family that he gives him a promotion, only to choke to death shortly after. In his will, he announces that the toy factory is being torn down, and everyone loses their job. Peter tries to find more work until Lois once more encourages him to follow his old dream of being a professional jouster at the Ren Fair, a dream he's had since the Black Knight saved his life decades ago. He trains for the event and is soon able to meet the knight in person, but he's rude and arrogant, even threatening Peter when one of his trophy winches talks to him. Peter gives up on his dream of jousting until visiting the fair with his family, where the undefeated knight challenges him and Peter accepts. As they are about to clash, Mort tows the knight's car, distracting him and giving Peter the victory. He then decides he's finished living his dream and the family walks into the sunset, with Chris voicing concern that Peter doesn't have his job back. Peter's motivated to become a professional jouster because he is inspired by a hero, the Black Knight. But when he learns that this knight is not the man he imagined him to be, he loses interest in the sport due to the pedestal being broken. The hero he looked up to not being such a great guy after all. It's not until he has something else to fight for, his personal honor, that he finally takes the field once again and learns the real lesson. Even if it's not worth becoming like the Black Knight, it's still worthwhile to follow your dreams in the interest of becoming like the version of the Black Knight you imagined. If your heroes aren't heroes, then be the person you wish they were. Peter had always been inspired by the idea of the guy anyway, as he didn't know the real Black Knight, so it's not much of a change. The plot to this episode generally follows the trends of an 80s sports movie, where the protagonist is trying to follow their old dream only to be shot down by a hero, then turns around to defeat that hero to prove they've overcome the challenge, not just physically but morally as well. The main reason Peter struggles in this episode is that he doesn't want to become like the Black Knight, and he succeeds when he realizes that he doesn't have to succeed. A fish out of water. Peter is wallowing in unemployment after losing his job last episode, eventually going for a walk with Brian, where he sees a group of fishermen, and becomes motivated to become one himself. He buys a boat at a police auction only to be warned of a legend of a fish named Daggermouth, who ate the previous owner Salty. Worse is that Peter had to take out a loan from a shady bank to pay for the boat, and that bank has repossessed their house preemptively, with another family already moving in. This goes unnoticed by Meg and Lois, as Lois is taking Meg to a spa due to her missing spring break, only to then take her to a spring break party afterwards, when Meg won't stop pouting, eventually having Lois realize she's having all the fun Meg was supposed to be having. Back in Peter's plot, Peter is concerned about losing the house and needs to come up with a way to buy it back, eventually proclaiming he's going to catch Daggermouth for the reward to pay off the bank, and his friends all join him on the hunt. But when they get to a cave where the fish is hiding, they learn it's merely an animatronic built by the missing Salty, who faked his death to hide in the cave and sell Daggermouth merchandise. He pays Peter $50,000 to keep his secret, and everything goes back to normal. Family Guy borrowed a lot from The Simpsons, and one of the defining features of that show was the fact that Homer seemed to have a new job every few episodes. This, of course, made the story seem a bit weird when he kept losing these jobs or not bothering to go into his old one at the nuclear plant. But these were questions rarely raised by the audience, as they didn't really matter to the episode-by-episode stories being told. In Family Guy, this aspect is borrowed, but not entirely. Peter has had so many subplots that would not be possible if he were employed full-time, and up until now it hasn't really been an issue. But to make sure it never becomes one, Peter loses his job last episode, and then proceeds not to have one for the next 6 years of the show. Granted, 5 of these years were spent not having new episodes. Making the episode's title into a double entendre is the B-plot, with Meg being taken to spring break parties by Lois, only to fail to find any fun, not because Lois is taking her to the wrong places, but because she is taking the wrong person. Meg wants to be popular like the other girls in her class, but isn't invited out, only to be taken out and then not have any fun. Her complaints at the start of the episode turn out not to be about the fact that she was never invited out, but because she wasn't the type of person to be invited out in the first place. The difference between Meg's popularity at the start of the festivities and at the end has far less to do with the activities changing, and more to do with Meg herself finally deciding to allow herself to enjoy the time, rather than assuming she isn't welcome. Emission Impossible. Lois's sister Carol has her husband walk out on her while she is pregnant, so Peter and Lois keep her company until the baby's born. After helping to deliver the baby, Peter and Lois start to consider having a 4th child themselves, and after announcing this to the family, Stewie panics over the prospect of no longer being the baby of the family. He vows to interrupt every attempt at conception between the two, joined in by Chris and Meg's usual arguing, but this only results in Lois and Peter trying harder to find time away from the rest. So Stewie takes drastic measures, shrinking himself down to destroy every sperm in Peter's body with a laser. But one sperm, piloted by Bertram, a potential child who is conniving at Stewie. The two plan to fight, but when Stewie's ship is about to grow back to its original size, they need to work together to escape, and in the process, Stewie learns that Bertram also hates Lois. Satisfied his potential little brother will be a good person, Stewie leaves Lois and Peter to their business, only for Lois to realize that with all the interruptions they've been having, they might not have time for a new child. It is interesting to compare the family dynamics in this episode to those in future and past episodes, or even the stereotypes of sitcoms that came before. The old trope of the obnoxious in-laws is sometimes played straight, such as with Lois's parents, but here, Peter seems genuinely kind to Carol, even going so far as to deliver her baby once the doctor's unconscious. This is then followed up on with Lois and Peter showing actual romance with one another, rather than the usual callous disdain Peter has for the safety and comfort of his family. Even Stewie is able to put aside his homicidal tendencies when he realizes that Bertram has a lot in common with him, and that the family being bigger will be a positive change. Family Guy is capable of being one of those shows sung about in the opening theme song, good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely. To Love and Die in Dixie. Chris gets a paper route to afford a present for a girl in his class only to behave awkwardly while giving it to her and lamenting he's too awkward around girls. Later on in this route, he witnesses a robbery and helps identify the criminal, though this criminal breaks out of jail later and threatens to kill Chris. So the Griffin family is placed into witness protection, sent to the Deep South in a town called Bumblescum. It takes a while to adapt, but eventually Peter and Brian get work as sheriff and deputy after reenacting the Dukes of Hazzard. Meg impresses the school children with her basic knowledge, and Chris meets Sam, with the two quickly being good friends, though this friendship is challenged when Chris gets kissed by Sam and later finds out she is a girl, which makes him run off as he is awkward around girls. The family then learns that the robber from before is seeking revenge against Chris and has found his location. Peter wants to get the townsfolk together to drive him off, but as he got them mad by pointing out inaccuracies in their Civil War reenactment, he and Brian are on their own. Though when they confront the criminal, the townsfolk show up anyway and they save the day, saying that, ideological differences aside, they're still neighbors. One of the main reasons later seasons of Family Guy are treated with disdain comes from the political tract that the showrunners include in the scripts. Not so much the subject matter of the tangents or the soapbox moments, and not even the fact that they're included at all, but the disdain that they would show for people who didn't already agree with them. It was to the point where even if you agreed with what the characters on screen were saying, you might still take exception with the tone with which it was said, or the believed necessity of using straw man arguments to make the points seem correct. This episode has a series of Southern conservative stereotypes that, while still viewed as punchlines, are merely attacks on the beliefs themselves, rather than the people who have them. The revisionist lost cause history being taught is viewed as a falsehood that has to be shown in so blunt a way, the only way someone would believe it is if they were never presented with an alternative, and then the schools are shown as not presenting an alternative. The ideology is flawed, but the people who believe in it are still kind and decent folks who save the Griffins, regardless of whether they believe in the same things. People are given the benefit of the doubt, not by the characters, but the narrative itself. Screwed the Pooch. The Griffins are visiting Lois's parents for the weekend, with Brian coming along as he has been feeling sexually frustrated lately. Peter makes several attempts to get along with Carter Pewterschmidt, but none of these work until he helps the guy beat Ted Turner in a game of poker, after which Carter starts to be friendly towards his son-in-law, inviting him out with his ultra-wealthy friends. But while they're at the dog races, Brian mounts and violates Carter's prize dog, Seabreeze, getting her pregnant and making Carter kick him and Peter out of his house. Brian tries to do the right thing and be a father to the new puppies, going so far as to run away with Seabreeze, though they're eventually caught and Brian gets put on trial for the right to raise his kids. Carter tries to force Peter to testify against Brian in exchange for accepting him back as a friend, but Peter refuses to do this, and Brian's allowed to see his kid, though only on the condition he be neutered. Brian accepts this arrangement, but before he can go through with it, the puppies are born, and they resemble Ted Turner, letting Brian off the hook, although he's still a bit disappointed as he was ready to be a father. Brian starts out this episode ashamed of his behavior, as he starts to lose control over himself and lose common sense to base animal instinct. And sure, he is an animal. He's always considered himself to be more than that, though, part of his characterization being the divide between these two aspects of who he is. So after getting Seabreeze pregnant, he vows to stay with her and be a father to the puppies, as this is not what a wild animal would do, and it's something that makes him more human. But simply saying he'll do something and actually doing it are two different things, and when it comes time to actually commit to the idea, Brian's told he needs to be neutered. This would normally be something unthinkable for the guy, but considering it was his libido that caused him to act like an animal in the first place, he's more willing to accept the idea, purely because it will make him less animalistic and more human, although it's worth mentioning again that Family Guy has already made the stance that raising children and being responsible is what actually makes you manly. Peter Griffin. Husband, father, brother? Peter hears Chris using African-American vernacular English after a basketball game and hears from Cleveland that it's likely because he has little connection to his own roots. So Peter tries to teach Chris about his Irish heritage, only to learn that one of his ancestors, Nate Griffin, was black. Now considering himself a black man, Peter tries to get in touch with his own heritage by following Cleveland around. But during a visit from Lois's parents, he learns about their side of the family, namely the fact that the Pewterschmidts owned Nate Griffin. When Peter confronts him about this, Carter pays him $20,000 to never bring it up again, and Peter immediately wastes this money on a recreation of Pee-wee's Playhouse. But the black community of Quahog is upset with him for this, as the rest of them have agreed to spend any reparation payments on charities and the like. Now shunned by both the black and white communities, Peter has a vision of his ancestor Nate Griffin, who tells him to stop seeing race so much. Peter then decides to share his reparations with everyone, solving the problem by throwing money at it. In the B-plot, Stewie thinks that the cheerleaders are capable of mind control and tries to infiltrate their ranks to figure out how they do it, only to get too caught up in the cheerleader lifestyle to succeed. Peter's only accepted by the black community of Quahog after giving a speech about the shared experiences that he's had with them, borrowed heavily from George McGovern with a bunch of pop culture references thrown in. This happening in spite of Peter's obvious white appearance shows that the experiences matter far more than aesthetic things, and the moral of the episode appears at that point. It's just that putting this speech into practice is what Peter fails to do later on. Community is about shared experience, so when he came into money, it was assumed that the money would be shared with the community, just as the suffering that earned him the money was. But Peter was only trying to justify his inclusion in the group rather than actually earning it, so when he spent it selfishly, this misjudgment was confirmed. But rather than the plot concluding by Peter learning a lesson on shared past experience, the episode ends with Peter accidentally giving away all the money he got, again, showing that instead of thinking himself as African American or Irish American, he just considers himself American. Ready, willing, and disabled. Spooner Street is having a charity car wash when a man in a mask rushes over and steals the money they raised. Joe chases after him and retrieves the money, but the man gets away, sending Joe into a depressive funk. To cheer him up, Peter enters Joe into the Special People's Games, an Olympic-like event for the disabled. Joe is nearing victory but can't quite make it, so to be sure of a win, Peter sneaks some steroids into Joe's water, giving him the edge he needs. Joe then begins to get sponsorships and movie deals, making Peter upset as he's not getting credit for a venture they did together. So he reveals to the public that he gave Joe steroids, making him lose everything and returning to the previous depressive funk. Meanwhile, the Griffin kids have found a money clip and they want to spend it, but they have to wait 2 weeks to make sure it goes unclaimed first. The three of them try to trick each other into giving it up until Brian manages to track down its owner, though the owner turns out to be the masked man from before. Joe chases him down and manages to catch the criminal this time, bringing him out of his funk. The original joke with Joe's character is that he was the most physically active and capable of the main cast in spite of his disability, making Peter's obesity even funnier by comparison. Here, a more serious look is attempted at Joe's lack of mobility and the way it causes him to think less of himself, but the way in which the plot is rushed ends up hurting it a bit. I'm aware Family Guy isn't a show known for its introspection of its cast, and this episode's a good example of how that manifests. There are so many jokes and cutaways in this episode that we get awkward moments like Joe's liquid steroid taking effect immediately and the entire crowd turning on him instantaneously before a drug test can be performed, as well as everyone glossing over the fact that Peter drugged his friend because, well, there's just not enough time in the episode for that point to be raised. This is once again Family Guy struggling with the back and forth between comedy and plot, with plot being the vehicle for comedy and very little more. A very special Family Guy Freakin' Christmas. It's a few days before Christmas and Peter's hanging out with his friends, including Joe, who's mourning the anniversary of his accident, refusing to let Peter drive drunk. While angry about this, Peter drops off all the Christmas presents at a charity drive instead of the one gift he was supposed to. After a failed attempt at stealing the presents back from the needy, the family goes to the mall to buy more, leaving Brian home alone to get the turkey out of the oven. But when a spark from the fireplace ignites Peter's last-minute tree while Brian is searching for oven mitts, the whole kitchen and living room area burns down. The family returns from the mall after Peter's attacked by fish while chasing an old woman, where Lois finally snaps because they're out of paper towels. She rampages downtown, eventually planning on destroying the Christmas tree in the middle of Quahog, but Stewie, who's been spending the episode trying to bargain with the omniscient Santa, puts on his part of the Christmas nativity play, which convinces Lois of the spirit of Christmas again. But the police tranquilize her anyway. In the end, everyone gathers back at the Griffin's house, where Peter finally gets to watch Kiss Saves Santa. So many holiday specials love to place emphasis on the magic of the holiday season, that Christmas miracles will solve all our problems. The reality, of course, is that Christmas miracles, capital letters and all, are really just the people closest to us putting in a bit of work to make sure that everything runs smoothly on the holidays. Sort of an abstraction of those morality plays about family and friends coming together. If Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year, it's only because everyone is trying their best to make it that way. It's not like this is inherently wrong, after all, thousands of holiday specials wouldn't lie to us, but it can be frustrating for people like Lois to put in a bunch of effort only for Jesus to take the credit. Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows. While lamenting that he cannot find an intellectual equal in the dating pool, Brian goes to a laser rock show with Peter's friends and gets arrested for drunk driving on the way home. He is sentenced to community service working with the elderly, assigned to do wellness checks on a reclusive woman named Pearl Burton. Pearl is a nasty woman who constantly harasses Brian and tells him he's not treating her well enough, eventually resulting in Brian telling her to drop dead as he leaves, preferring prison to her. But when he sees a special on TV about her life, specifically how she used to sing commercial jingles and quit when people didn't take to her attempts to branch out into opera, Brian returns just in time to stop her from putting his advice into practice. He then convinces Pearl to leave her house for the first time in decades by promising in song to catch her up on all the intervening years, though she gets hit by a truck as soon as he leaves. Meanwhile, Peter grows out a beard during Brian's prison sentence so he can be more like Grizzly Adams, only for an endangered bird to nest in his facial hair. This bird harasses him for days before flying off, leaving 3 chicks behind. Peter raises these birds for a while until they get too old to remain and he has to finally release them into the wild. As he is saying his goodbyes, Brian uses a virtual reality helmet from the Laser Rock show to give Pearl a glimpse into the life she could have had. This is one of those episodes of Family Guy that shows the writers are fully capable of including real human emotion rather than random disconnected gags if they want to. The last few montages of Peter releasing his birds and Brian showing Pearl what her life could have been like are devoid of gags for an extended period. For a show that normally has a joke every 10 seconds or less, to go a few minutes without cutting away from the emotion to make a fart joke or something marks a notable attention grab to the audience. And that makes this episode's ending work in a way that it wouldn't have if every episode of Family Guy tried to do this sort of emotional storytelling. Is it on par with what one could expect from later shows that explicitly try to pull at the audience's heartstrings? Not really. But the fact that it's Family Guy putting down the comic slapstick for a few minutes to have an episode end with 2 characters losing something they love is what makes the ending work, the difference between the expected outcome and what was delivered. It is also interesting to note Brian's characterization here versus later seasons, namely that he is trying to find an intellectual equal among the women he's looking for, only to fail to notice one when she's right in front of him, not as though Pearl herself was making any effort to get to know people. She became a recluse because she also tried to put her brain out there instead of her voice and got rejected, part of why she and Brian had so much common ground. They both thought they were the only smart person left on the planet. From method to madness. Brian goes to an audition to show off his acting, only for Stewie's monologue to get noticed when he tries to defend Brian being rejected. Stewie is then picked up for a spot in a prestigious performing arts school where he meets Olivia, another child actress who, despite being talented, refuses to work with others. When Stewie hears that the two are about to be dropped from the program for their inability to cooperate, he and Olivia put on a duet that immediately becomes popular, though when their constant bickering behind the scenes spills out onto the stage, they lose the act and go their separate ways. Stewie winds up failing again and again before eventually winding up alone and insane, while Olivia makes it in Hollywood. Meanwhile, Peter rescues a man, Dave Campbell, from drowning and gets invited to the family's house as a thank you. But when they arrive, they're put off by the fact that the Campbells are nudists. Meg ends up falling for their son, Jeff, something Peter and Lois forbid. But when they realize they've been too harsh on their daughter, they invite Jeff over themselves, greeting him in the nude, which grosses out Meg. Stewie and Olivia are told they're going to be dropped from a program because they cannot work with other people, an obstacle they overcome by putting on the facade of being capable of cooperation. But that's the thing, this is a facade, not the truth. In reality, their relationship is a transactional one. They only put up with the other person to get something in return, so if they're not performing, they're going to bicker. Worse, their real motivations remain the same. They want to be the best and don't really care on who they step on to get there. So it's only a matter of time before one of them ends up successful, and because Stewie's a major character, that winds up being Olivia, while Stewie stays home wondering what could have been. His success was never meant to be because the obstacles to that success were never truly overcome, just avoided. What is overcome, however, is the prejudice that Peter and Lois feel towards the Campbell family, their nudist habit making the Griffins uncomfortable enough that they end up forbidding their daughter from seeing a boy, even though she really feels something for the guy. And based on the fact that she's maintaining eye contact, this is something genuine. So they embrace something they find uncomfortable at first in order to accept their daughter, because it's one thing to keep a stranger with strange habits out of your house, but another to keep your own family out because they're mimicking these habits. This is also a pretty standard plot. Parents don't accept the lifestyle of their teenage child's friend or significant other, they learn to be more accepting, and everyone lives happily ever after. This being Family Guy, though, they need to push at the censors a bit to make the audience feel the same discomfort as Lois and Peter. Stuck together, torn apart. While trying to stop him from eating glue, Brian's hand gets stuck to Stewie's, and the solvent they need won't arrive for another 2 weeks. Not wanting to disappoint Lois, Brian hides the fact that he's glued to Stewie from her as the two are forced to spend time together until the solvent arrives. As they're waiting for it to take effect, they find a small girl in a well and use their extended reach to rescue her just as the glue wears off. In the A-plot, Lois meets her college boyfriend only for Peter to follow her in Joe's police surveillance van. Peter tries to make her jealous by inviting over a prostitute and pretending she's one of his own lovers, so Lois demands to go to a marriage therapist to figure out what to do about Peter's jealousy. The therapist recommends that they separate for a while to get some context for their relationship, and the two start seeing other people, Lois dating Quagmire and Peter dating Mort's niece, Jennifer Love Hewitt. The two couples go to the same restaurant, where Lois is jealous over the actress fawning over Peter's habits and she attacks the other woman, with Peter and Lois realizing they're both the jealous type and that they ought to work on their bad habits together. I always feel as though the finale to Stewie and Brian's plot was just thrown in because not a lot was done with the character beats of having Brian and Stewie glued together. It's the type of wacky situation you would see in any old show, and it's used almost entirely for gags. Then, when they realized the episode was about to end and no one learned anything, Brian went from trying to keep Lois from finding out he was irresponsible to, well, nothing. The plot point is dropped when Lois starts dating again. Stewie is blackmailed to keep quiet by a noodle incident gag. The showrunners throw a daring rescue to make it look like there was an obstacle overcome. Peter and Lois have the real plot to this episode, the dysfunction caused by Peter obsessing over Lois as a trophy wife instead of as a person, insinuating some deep mistrust that he has of her, as if she would jump to the next possible relationship if given the chance. But then we find out Lois feels the same way about Peter, and the two are equally toxic, which is actually a starting point for Lois and Peter to feel a bit more empathy for one another's position. As long as they're both aware they have some bad tendencies, then they can start to work on these. Road to Europe. Peter and Lois hear about Kiss Talk, a 5-day concert tour for their favorite band Kiss. They leave their family home to follow the band around, only for Gene Simmons to offer Lois the chance to sing their most iconic song's most iconic line, and she flubs it, demotivating the band from playing music ever again. Peter is furious that Lois merely pretended to be a Kiss fan because he was, until they see the band without makeup at a Denny's. Here, Lois finally recognizes the lead singer as an old college boyfriend, and Peter once again thinks Lois is cool. Meanwhile, Stewie has run away to find Jolly Farm Review, his favorite show, and live among the cast. He and Brian sneak onto a plane only to wind up in the Middle East with no money. They use song and dance to distract merchants and steal a camel, trekking to a hot air balloon they take to Italy, then up to Amsterdam before finally arriving in England to the broadcasting headquarters where Stewie is finally able to run around on a set, until he learns it's a set, not real. Heartbroken, he and Brian return home in time to reunite with the other Griffins, with Stewie moving on from his old interest. Another Road to episode featuring Stewie and Brian traveling the world so one of them can visit a specific site, while Peter and Lois go through marital problems. In the first episode, we saw Brian trying to go back to his childhood home to finally get some closure with his mother, and here Stewie is fleeing the present, afraid that Peter and the rest are a bad influence on his development. But by the end, he realizes the ideal life he was planning on living in Britain was a falsehood, something put on by networks, and the real life he had wasn't worth running away from in the first place, as there's at least one positive influence there in Brian, who was with Stewie on his entire journey till the end, when he recognized that the baby ought to learn his own lessons. This approach to child rearing, where Brian knows when to be hands-on and when to be hands-off, shows a better commitment to ensuring Stewie turns out alright than whatever Lois and Peter did this episode. Family Guy Viewer Mail number 1. Brian and Stewie present 3 episode ideas submitted by viewer requests. Unlike the next time they do this type of episode, they are actual suggestions from fans. The first episode is about Peter getting 3 wishes from a genie and his beer bottle. He wastes the first 2 and winds up with his own theme music, then wishes he had no bones when he's threatened for having the music following him. With no bones, he becomes an amorphous blob, as well as a burden on his family, so he flushes himself down the toilet and winds up with all the rest of America's waste in Hollywood. There he gets a job as a cushion for stuntsmen, only to be noticed at a party by a doctor who has an experimental procedure to put bones back in his body. These bones are then revealed to have been donated by the rest of the Griffin family, and the misshapen family drags themselves home. In the second act, a truck full of nuclear waste crashes in front of the Griffin's house, and Chris sprays everyone with it. The family then develops superpowers, and in spite of Lois's warnings not to misuse these, they all start to abuse the town of Quahog. Peter and Meg steal hair from NSYNC, Chris immolates students who were mean to him, Lois crushes the other cars in traffic, and Stewie tosses people around with his telekinesis. So Mayor Adam West vows to stop the Griffins with his superpowers, rolling around in toxic waste and then developing cancer. This works as the Griffins feel so bad about giving Adam West cancer that they vow to use their powers only for good. The third act is about Quahog babies, with the kids swearing off of women until Lois Pewterschmidt moves in. When Lois says she likes brave men, Quagmire and Peter both spend the night in a haunted mansion to prove they're brave, only to try to scare the other one out early. They're both scared out of the house when another ghost appears to haunt them, and after seeing baby newscasters reporting on their cowardice, they come clean to Lois, who says she doesn't care about brave men anymore and prefers smart men, like Mort, revealed to be the one behind the ghost. So Quagmire and Peter both swear off a woman for good, cutting to the future to reveal themselves as millionaires who have sex with bagels. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. While struggling to help Chris with his math homework, Peter is confronted by a door-to-door salesman who sells him volcano insurance using Lois's rainy day fund. When Stewie breaks Meg's glasses and Lois can't find her money to buy a new pair, she confronts Peter about his poor financial skills. So Peter goes to the Clam where his friends are all showing off the money they've gotten from their competent financial planners. But the takeaway Peter gets from these conversations is that he needs to find a Jewish man to manage his money for him. After singing a song called I Need a Jew, a Jewish man named Max Weinstein's car breaks down outside the Griffin household, and Peter takes him in. In exchange for sheltering him and letting him use their phone, as well as Peter being a little bit aggressive, Max agrees to help Peter get his money back, as well as aiding Chris with his homework. But his car gets fixed before he can do the second task, and he leaves, saying Chris is part of a nice family and will do fine. But Peter once again misinterprets this as a justification to convert Chris to Judaism. He takes Chris to Las Vegas for a quick bar mitzvah, like a Vegas wedding, and when Lois finds out from Brian, she rushes over to stop it. But the other Jews in the temple assume that Lois is an anti-Semite, so they chase the whole family out as Peter realizes his mistake. This episode has a pretty remarkable story behind its creation, first being written for the second season only for the script to be reworked due to not being up to standards. Then the second draft of the script was rejected for not being up to standards and practices, leaving the fully produced episode in limbo, not aired on television for a few years, before being released as part of the DVD sets. It now gets airtime, albeit a censored version of the original. Well, not the original, but you get it. But this episode's censorship isn't really something justified, though possibly only by today's standards. The jokes aren't really at the expense of Jewish people. We're meant to laugh at Peter's massive misunderstandings and his eagerness to fall into stereotypes that he sees on, you guessed it, TV and movies. As much as television is able to influence our tastes and beliefs about the world, it is just as capable of presenting and then reinforcing stereotypes. When you watch a lot of TV, you're going to assume that people act the way they do on TV. If a character's religious beliefs or ethnicity are intentionally brought attention to, then there's a reason for that, and the character's behavior is often either meant to play into stereotypes or actively avoids doing so, which then draws attention to these stereotypes anyway. Petarded. Spooner Street is hosting a family game night, and, to boost Peter's confidence, Lois swaps out his Trivial Pursuit cards with the preschool version. Peter, now assuming he's a genius, starts to talk down to everyone else, so Brian asks him to prove his intellect by being tested, where he finds out that he is legally retarded. Peter spends a few days being spoken down to and treated poorly until he accidentally hits a man with his car, only to not be charged due to his disability. Peter then wanders around doing whatever he wants with no consequences before entering a fast food restaurant and splashing Lois with boiling oil. While Lois is recovering in the hospital, the Griffin children are taken away, as Peter is an unfit parent. While the kids are staying at Cleveland's, Peter plans to get them back by hiring prostitutes to make his neighbor look bad, but this only gets Peter in further legal trouble. But while he's wallowing at home alone, Lois comes back with the kids and everything is fixed. Nothing really changes between Peter being diagnosed as retarded versus his previous behavior, but then again, nothing really changed between Peter assuming himself a genius because he won at Trivial Pursuit and his behavior earlier, other than, of course, the fact that he believed it to be the case. In real psychology, there's a difference made between a diagnosis and a prognosis. The fact that someone is diagnosed as retarded, for example, has much less to do than one might think with how they are actually going to live with that diagnosis. It is a tool for the person being diagnosed to figure out how they want to live their life, to understand that their brain might work differently for better and for worse. In Peter's case, undoubtedly for the worse, though instances like his still heavily influence the way people react to their own diagnoses. The most common example is a diagnosis of Asperger's or autism spectrum disorder. Just because you are autistic doesn't mean you can't lead a normal life, and in fact many autistic people, if given the opportunity, would reject a pill that cured them of the malady. Peter's one such example of a person who acts a certain way because he thinks that's how people like him are supposed to act. Or is he? Because for as much trouble as Peter gets into during this episode, this is also the moment of Family Guy where Peter's long-term personality begins to solidify. He was pre-cancellation a bumbling but well-intentioned cartoon dad. Family Guy took a lot from The Simpsons. But post-cancellation, he's far more antagonistic towards the people closest to him, picking random fights and making people's lives worse with his antics while showing no regard for anyone's well-being. The end of the episode does not have Peter learning his diagnosis was wrong or the test was messed up in some way. He remains retarded as the credits roll, and this winds up being true for the rest of the show. PTV. Peter misses a trouser malfunction at the Emmys due to Lois's insistence they see Meg's school play, made worse when the FCC complaints regarding the incident caused the agency to start heavily censoring everything on air. In frustration about the censorship, Peter decides to make his own TV station, PTV, where he shows uncensored television to get high ratings, eventually branching out to give his friends and family their own original programming. But after causing Lois to crash her car after taking a dump on her windshield, she makes a complaint to the FCC herself that causes the agency to arrive and confiscate all of Peter's equipment. They then go even further and start to censor real life, blasting air horns when people swear and telling the Griffins they can no longer make love. This causes Lois to realize that Peter was right and everyone ought to self-regulate instead of letting the FCC do it for them. So Peter goes to the Capitol and points out how much various monuments look profane, causing the policy to be rolled back. Family Guy has had a long history of feuds against the FCC and other various groups calling for the censorship of the show for content that, frankly, has it coming a lot of the time. But while Family Guy regularly flaunts the barrier of decency, the principle of the matter is far more important than the details of what's being said. The common argument against this sort of thing is never actually along the lines of people shouldn't have the right to say or air what they want to, but rather, censorship invariably tries to appeal to a person's sense of disgust. It's never about stopping people from saying what they want, but arguing that it's obscene to do so, and we have to think about the kids. As long as people are grossed out by what they see on TV, then authoritarianism will be able to create a foothold. And once they can control what you see, hear, or read, they can start to go after what you say or think or write. Is Family Guy highbrow entertainment? No. But arguing that something has to have intellectual merit in order to be considered free speech is just another way of arguing that someone ought to be in charge of deciding what can and can't be said. No one has a right to decide whether another person gets that freedom of expression, and it's up to individuals to self-regulate what they and their kids are exposed to, rather than passing off the responsibility, and therefore the rights, to another person. PTV was a crude and profane network, but its existence normalizes other networks to say and think what they want to, even if Peter's side boob is a bit gross. Meet the Quagmires. While lamenting that he spent so long dating Lois that he never had a chance to spend his young adulthood partying, Peter makes a deal with death to go back in time to relive his youth. He's transported back to the country club where he met Lois, blowing off a date with her to party with Cleveland, where he meets and makes out with Molly Ringwald. Peter and Brian then wake up in the future, only to see that Lois is now married to Quagmire while he's married to the former Brat Pack star, as well as several other changes that Brian views as positives. But Peter just wants Lois back, so he asks Death to send him back again so he can fix what he did wrong, only to screw up and party with Cleveland some more. Peter tries to win Lois back again, but it's too late and she's now happily in a relationship with Quagmire rather than the passionless Peter. But after failing to convince her to reject him, Peter punches out Quagmire, which convinces Lois that he has passion after all, and Brian celebrates the family reappearing by rickrolling the audience. Did they really do rickrolling back in 2007? I know that was around the time it started to get popular, but with the 5th season starting to air in late 2006, I doubt they would have been able to respond so quickly to what was at the time a pretty niche internet joke. I think it was still considered duck roll at the time this episode was being produced. Anyway, did you know that Seth MacFarlane watched a lot of TV in the 80s? Because this episode consists almost entirely of 80s references, from movies to celebrity news, even a few politics of the day. In fact, it's probably a bit redundant to say that this episode is all references to stuff that happened in the 80s because that's more or less the entire show's humor, whether it's direct references to events or more indirect digs at overused tropes from the time period. We've already had a plot where Peter goes back in time to revisit his relationship with Lois, only this time his motivations are more about enjoying the 80s. What also makes this episode retread less ground is the fact that it isn't only Peter revisiting the 80s to mess around, but the creators themselves. That decade has a nostalgic hold over folks like Seth MacFarlane, and thus has a hold over the way that Family Guy presents itself. But the 80s are getting further and further away with each year as the intended audience starts to forget all about this decade that so many of them didn't actually grow up in. Stewie kills Lois. Brian gives Lois tickets to a cruise for her birthday, and she takes Peter with her, but Peter is constantly making inappropriate jokes and doing things that embarrass Lois. Stewie's furious he was not taken on the cruise with them, and goaded by Brian, who recently called him out for never following through on his plans to kill Lois, Stewie kills Lois after she has an argument with Peter, and then he escapes with Lois's body never being found. A year later, Peter gets a life insurance policy payout from Lois's death, and Joe grows suspicious over how quickly he moved on. Around this time, Brian starts picking up on hints from Stewie regarding Lois's death, so Stewie disposes of the evidence just as Joe and the others are going through Peter's trash, connecting the wrong man to the crime. Peter is sent to court, and during the trial continuously incriminates himself with suspicious behavior. But just before he can be sentenced, Lois bursts into the courtroom, saying it was not Peter who killed her, but Stewie. After Lois regales the tale of how Stewie tried to kill her and how she came back to Quahog, the baby runs away, appearing back at the Griffin household and holding all of them hostage. He kills Cleveland and makes fun of Joe before forcing Brian to drive him to the CIA headquarters for a brief American Dad cameo, before threatening to shut down the world's power grid unless they declare him president of the world. Stewie then has a large musical number detailing his various plans for arbitrary laws and lists of his enemies, which finally prompts Lois to finish her revenge against her child, arming herself with Stewie's stash of weapons back home and rushing the capital herself to fight the megalomaniacal infant. The two fight for a while, but Lois can't bring herself to actually kill Stewie, but Peter can, saving the day and finally putting down the infant for good, until it's revealed this was all a simulation Stewie had run in response to Brian saying that he never follows through on his plans. Brian then points out that it's lazy writing to simply dismiss the last 2 episodes as a simulation. Stewie is taunted by Brian at the start of the episode for always talking about his plans to kill Lois but never actually going through with them. At this point, his death threats are more of a character quirk than a real dynamic. Stewie hates his mother and claims he hates her so much he'll kill her, but it's just a figure of speech by now. But when you make figures of speech out of your goals, they stop being goals and start being flaws, proof that you talk much bigger than you act. So Stewie's dynamic with Lois starts to be less and less impactful as his characterization is weaker for the long-running gag, having no resolution. And what temporary resolution we get during this episode is more luck-based than anything. Stewie winds up ruining his perfect getaway by bragging to Brian, and he only pins the blame on Peter through happenstance. If Stewie did really try to take over the world, or even just kill one person, he'd need a lot of contrivance to do so. Of course, Stewie was not actually going to kill Lois. The audience is aware of this as soon as they read the episode's title because we know the name of the show is Family Guy, so anytime a character is killed off, it's not a matter of whether the creators are bluffing, but rather the audacity with which they circumvent the title's promise that Stewie kills Lois. And the way in which Lois's death is subverted is actually twofold. First, she didn't actually die because she came back, and second, she didn't actually die because the entire thing was a simulation. This might have been a shocking sort of problem for another show to have to justify, but Family Guy's already had similar endings before. The Season 2 episode, Da Boom, saw the entire town of Quahog leveled, then rebuilt a few miles down near a Twinkie factory, with the episode being revealed as the dream of a character from a soap opera. And nearly every other episode had a similar continuity reset between credit sequences, to the point that actually keeping some sort of long-term consequence to a character dying off is lampshaded here, Stewie pointing out Mr. Weed's death almost 8 years before this episode aired. In fact, we've even seen continuity resetting between gags of this episode. Peter can get mauled for a cutaway and then be fine in the following scene. So even having Lois killed off might have been possible had Family Guy simply brought her back at the beginning of next episode, rather than the middle of a two-parter. So the question that has to be answered is not, how will Family Guy change with a character dead? It's not even, how will Family Guy bring back a dead character? Nor is it, how is Family Guy going to justify the rug pull? The real question to be answered is, why do we care that Lois is going to be dead for this week? And it's answered by having Stewie's motivations be tied to whether he can really do it. The fact that the whole thing is revealed to be a simulation is an affordance made not for Family Guy, but the sake of the genre and the audience expectations from it. The characters are going to come back, so let's at least give a nod to the audience that we know this too. At least they bothered to justify the episode's ending instead of just cutting to black mid-sentence. Rhode to the Multiverse. To show off how he obtained a freakish, genetically mutated pig for Quahog's Clam Day, Stewie explains multiverse theory to Brian, that there are an infinite number of parallel universes that are each slightly different than ours. Stewie takes the duo to a new universe without the medieval Dark Ages, where science is significantly advanced, and it's impressive enough to Brian that he wants to see even more universes. So they hop around, mostly going through a series of gimmicks and take-thats to other shows, before winding up in a universe where dogs are the dominant species and humans are subservient. Stewie is prepared to leave, but Brian wants to stay longer, and as they're fighting over the remote, it gets smashed. So Brian and Stewie go to the Griffin's house to try to figure out something, only for the dog Stewie to recognize the other two as multiverse travelers too. But before he can transport them back, the human Stewie bites dog Peter and is taken to the pound to be put down. So Brian, and Stewie work to free Stewie, barely making the portal in time for the three of them to escape, as human Brian wanted to see our universe for himself. Once confirming their home, they say goodbye to human Brian as he vows to go explore the world, and then he gets hit by a car. This episode doesn't really have a plot and is just a bunch of cutaways with a single through line connecting them. Family Guy usually gets complaints for its humor being totally disconnected from the storylines in this way, but here, the bare minimum is done to ensure there's at least some relevance to the plot, and as a result, the plot is really just an excuse for alternate timeline jokes. There's a little bit at the end about rescuing Stewie, but this gets little screen time, and importantly, it gets very few jokes based on the story because the jokes in Family Guy are rarely supported by the story. This lack of attention almost highlights the way in which cutaway gags are essential to the comedy flow of Family Guy. They are the cause of its popularity and the cause of its lack of credibility. Because apparently a joke is only worth telling in the context where it makes sense to, rather than where a comedic beat could be inserted. And sure, humor is more memorable when it doesn't come out of nowhere but connects to what becomes before and after. But this only makes the comedic stylings of Family Guy that much more interesting. Nonsense cutaway gags are far more difficult to write for, due to not having any past experience of the characters to lean into. The joke has to be totally self-contained from setup to punchline, and as a result, none of them are naturally occurring punchlines, making things easier for the writers. Family Guy chose a more difficult method to write its jokes and has received both acclaim and criticism for doing so. Brian and Stewie. Brian and Stewie are at the bank checking on Brian's safety deposit box when the vault door closes automatically on them and they are trapped. Stewie soils himself when the doors close and, not wanting a rash or infection, tries to convince Brian to clean the mess by eating it, since he's a dog. This leads to an altercation involving Brian's gun, as well as Stewie wasting what is left of his phone's battery life in an attempt to return a sweater. After a while, Brian gets the bottle of liquor out of his vault to drink to pass the time, offering Stewie a sip, before both of them are drunk enough that Stewie asks Brian to pierce his ear using a needle from his sweater. Brian assures him the botched piercing is fine, and they start to discuss the dog whisperer, notably how dogs live in the moment. Though when Stewie points out that Brian doesn't really live in the moment as he claims to, their argument results in the two insulting each other before Stewie admits he didn't really need his diaper cleaned and only asked Brian to do that to see if he would. This is when Brian realizes the whole thing has been recorded by a security camera, and their response winds up with Brian's gun being fired, despite his claims it was unloaded. After taking shelter from the ricochet, the two share some of Stewie's food before he asks why Brian had a gun in the first place if he's so anti-firearms. Brian admits the gun and the alcohol were for a potential escape route in case his life became too unbearable, and Stewie assures Brian that his life isn't worth taking as he's Stewie's only real friend. Eventually, the vault doors open, and Brian carries Stewie out. An episode with no music and no voice work other than Seth MacFarlane's work for Stewie and Brian. It's based on the episode of All in the Family where Archie's trapped in the cellar. The idea behind this sort of bottle episode is to strip out every possible gimmick from the show in order to make the characters into the only focus. No musical accompaniment means the audience gets no assistance in figuring out the tone the showrunners are going for. No cutaways or gimmicks means you have nothing interrupting the plot to reset an emotional beat with neutral humor. The smaller the cast is, the fewer complications there are towards the goal of the episode, a character exploration of Brian and Stewie. And what is explored here is the dynamic between the two and how such a duo could form naturally. Stewie's a sociopath, at least he likes to pretend that he is. His diaper scheme in the episode is meant to be a power play over Brian to show off that he's capable of manipulation if he wants to be, though Stewie later admits that this was a fabrication to justify his actions made up after the fact. How true either of these assessments are is left up to the audience, and one can imagine that he really did just want to hurt Brian in a more tragic storyline compared to trying to dominate him in a more comedic storyline. Brian also mentioned that he keeps a gun inside his safety deposit box as an exit strategy, but this has far less to do with a real suicidal tendency than it does with options. No matter how bad things get, he has some control over how it will end, at least that's what he tells himself. But then again, the audience is not given flourishes to indicate tone, and so the interpretation is left up to us. And then there were fewer. The whole town of Quahog, at least recurring named characters, gets invited to a dinner in their honor taking place in a mansion in the woods. Upon arriving and wondering why they're there, James Woods appears and confesses he is a born-again Christian, inviting the town over to apologize for the wrongs he's done to them over the years. But when James Woods steps out for a moment and the others grow suspicious of his whereabouts and motives, Quagmire's date Stephanie is killed by a gunshot from nowhere, making the whole group panic as they worry that he actually lured them out to kill them one by one. When they try to flee, the bridge is taken out by a thunderstorm, and with no signal, everyone decides they have to investigate to see what's really going on. But when James Woods comes out from the kitchen and learns everyone thinks he's a murderer, the lights flicker and Woods himself winds up dead, meaning that one of the citizens of Quahog is the killer. After discovering a timer attached to a firearm and Peter accidentally knocks out Joe, Peter leads the investigation, learning from everybody what their motivation for killing James Woods could have been before Brian discovers a large stash of drugs given to him by Muriel, with everyone assuming it was her. But during another power outage, Muriel makes a run for it, and the whole cast splits up into groups to track her down, eventually stumbling upon her dead body as they realize she could not have been the murderer, as the same knife was used to kill her. Derek, Brian's ex-girlfriend's current husband, realizes he has a bit of a phone signal, so he heads to the roof to call for help when he's also accosted by the killer and knocked out with a golden globe, falling to his death. Realizing they'll find the killer if they find the award, the whole cast makes a human blob to keep them all accounted for when they discover not only the Golden Globe, but the dead body of James Wood's girlfriend, the one who converted him, in Tom Tucker's room. Tom Tucker makes a run for it, but is eventually captured, with the storm clearing up as the suspect is now in custody. But as they're leaving, Lois asks Diane Simmons if she'll be okay, only to hear plans that Diane's already been preparing for a solo broadcast, deducing that Tom Tucker was framed. Diane explains her motivation for killing James and framing Tom, admitting that the other murders were to cover her tracks, and then she leads Lois outside to close the last loose end when Diane herself is shot, revealed to be killed by Stewie, as if anyone is going to kill Lois, it's going to be him. A pretty faithful homage to Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, not that this was ever meant to be subtle. It's spelled out for the audience that this episode was going to be a bit above and beyond the expectations. And it's its exact attention paid to the spectacle that makes the episode worth watching. I've stated before, maybe too many times already, that Family Guy struggles with stakes and drama to any of the character beats due to the fact that its continuity resets every episode, and thus, when a character's life is at risk, we don't really care. But just having a longer opening and making the episode a double feature, as well as being at the start of a season, means the audience is primed to expect the unexpected. So when someone gets murdered, they're gone for good. These deaths wound up being canon, so Muriel Derrick and Diane Simmons all wind up missing from the show outside of flashbacks and offhanded mentions. James Woods returns in a later episode that's not covered in this retrospective. Sure, none of these characters were major, and 2 of the deaths come from characters introduced the same episode they're killed off in, but Diane being permanently replaced does become a feature of later episodes, started here. And since Family Guy has such a close relationship to the world of television while having a certain reverence for the medium, a newscaster being replaced still has a decent impact. At the very least enough that Diane Simmons being killed off is noticeable, instead of garnering an, oh yeah, she still exists, reaction. Even though her replacement is basically just a blonde Diane Simmons. What's also notable about this episode is the lack of cutaway gags, the 2 we see being directly related to the plot. To compensate for these missing jokes, there's a greater focus on meta humor, things ranging from Peter dividing people up based on what groups would be funny to see together, to Lois pointing out how seldom the show passes the Bechdel test. Even more esoteric gags, like the entire cast forming a human blob instead of having individual character moments towards the end, as though the writers were exhausted, trying to keep over a dozen distinct personalities and Meg from reacting to a different situation. Family Guy's had a few episodes in the past that have subverted the typical tone of the series to great success, and I think it's the fact that it was a subversion that made these episodes work so much better than had the plots been standalone. Because obviously, if you want to read Agatha Christie, you can read Agatha Christie. Family Guy's a different thing altogether, but being able to see characters you've known for 8 seasons come together to reenact a mystery novel works on a different level that's normally reserved for really edgy fanfiction. Seahorse, Seashell, Party. A hurricane is still hitting Quahog and the television goes out, meaning everyone has to entertain themselves. Brian decides to take a few mushrooms out of a hiding spot he has and tells Stewie he's going to take them to pass the time. But after a few bad hallucinations, he runs into the bathroom and cuts off his ear, so Stewie reattaches it and tries to help him through his visually interesting but narratively worthless trip. Back in the living room, Peter is trying to entertain himself with a few long gags about dad noises and talking through charades, when Meg tells him off for being too obnoxious, only for the rest of the family to take Peter's side despite having been equally annoyed by his antics. Meg then points out that they always talk down to her and tears into Lois for being a bad mother, Chris for being a bad brother, and Peter for being a bad person. The family all runs off in separate directions, sobbing to themselves as Brian praises Meg for finally standing up for herself. But seeing how wrecked the rest of the family is, Meg wonders if her role as a punching bag isn't the only thing keeping them together, and she falsely confesses that everything was her fault to fix everything. At first, Meg's character was disliked because of the fact that she had so little to do in each episode, itself a result of the fact that the writers didn't know what to do with her character. This was the result of Meg being the least relatable character in Family Guy to a mostly male writing staff. They didn't know what to write for a teenage girl because they were not, nor had ever been, teenage girls themselves. Didn't seem to stop them from writing a lot of gags for Quagmire, but I'll just leave that alone. She was the least favorite of fans as her plotline seemed to distract from potential better stories and jokes with the other better written characters. So the only jokes that worked involving her were things that could have been at anyone's expense, the typical slapstick every member of the Griffin family was exposed to. Because these were the only jokes that worked on Meg, though, these wound up being the focus of her character as there was nothing else there. So over the years, Meg went from a pretty generic teenage girl with all the associated tropes into the Griffin family's punching bag. Her crush on Kevin Swanson was gone, her obsession with popularity at school was gone, and, well, she didn't really have anything else. But after a few seasons of abuse targeting Meg, something started to change. The abuse was far more than her character ever really deserved, so to speak. Because every member of the cast was involved in some kind of shenanigans, and none of them were very good people, as Meg points out in this episode. But Meg had very few moments where she actually acted cruel or acted like anything at all, and yet the audience constantly saw her harassed and belittled by everyone else, making it curious what she actually did to deserve that. Basically, the audience didn't like Meg, but they didn't hate her either. The writers interpreted this as hatred, though, so soon the audience started to feel sorry for her, though episodes like this posit that she has nothing else going for her, and thus she has to be the punching bag. Otherwise, she's not anything at all. Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Quagmire. The boys go fishing only for Quagmire not to show up, and when they investigate his disappearance, they learn he passed out during autoerotic asphyxiation. While in the hospital, he gets visited by his sister Brenda, who brings along her boyfriend Jeff. Jeff constantly yells at Brenda to the point of keeping the others up all night, so they try to do something about it. First, they have Lois try to talk to her one-on-one, and then they attempt an intervention, where Quagmire mourns the woman Brenda used to be. But neither of these things get through to her, as instead she announces that she is pregnant, and they're getting married. Quagmire suggests that the other men simply kill Jeff, but Joe attempts to talk him down from outright murder until they see him striking her one more time. The men lure Jeff into the woods alone to do it, but Jeff figures this out and knocks out Peter and Joe, strangling Quagmire nearly to death and preparing to bury him. But because Quagmire has experience choking himself, he clings to life and hits the guy with his car, killing the abuser. They then forge a note from Jeff to Brenda saying he's leaving her alone and never coming back to cover up what they did. Earlier in this retrospective, I've praised Family Guy's ability to change gears and create an episode where the comedy pulls a backseat to a real character moment with actual drama and let it shine through. This is not one of those episodes. There is an attempt made to play an abusive relationship for drama that falls flat for a plethora of reasons, the least of which is the fact that Family Guy's never played this sort of thing for drama in the past. Abuse is a common source of humor for Family Guy, so when they turn around to try to make it seem like a serious issue, it rings as a hollow sentiment, especially when Quagmire's the one pleading with his sister to stop enabling it, as Quagmire of all people is the least respectful towards women. And that's the other major issue this episode has with trying to present serious subject matter. Even in a vacuum, it completely fails at presenting an authentic depiction of abuse. Jeff's rage is played so over the top, he stops being a real person, so the issue feels far too extreme to be a teachable moment. In real life, most abusers are regular in public. Their abuse is only done in private moments, and it's typically much more subtle, to the point that most abusers are capable of masquerading as normal people, rather than outwardly appearing as a deadbeat. And finally, Brenda's shown to be the one in the wrong for bothering to stay with someone who treats her poorly. This also presents an inauthentic view of real abuse. The perpetrator typically starts out as a normal person and slowly becomes abusive over time. By the time the abuse has reached its zenith, it's often far too late for the victim to leave through a combination of mental barriers like nostalgia for a nicer person, as well as the physical ones. This episode nearly touches on these barriers, including a lack of friends and family to help out. Brenda explains that Jeff doesn't allow her to meet with other people, and the closest people to Brenda typically just look the other way while she's abused in front of them. And of course, financial and societal traps like not being able to leave due to a pregnancy or a lack of financial support to survive without the abuser, as well as the knowledge that society tends to look down on single mothers of fatherless children far more than it looks down on the men who walked out on them. Back to the pilot. In order to look for a tennis ball Brian buried in the yard, he and Stewie go back in time to January 1st, 1999, the day he buried it, which is also the day the pilot aired and thus took place. Upon arriving, they are weirded out by the old quirks of the cast before Stewie returns to his old room so they can transport themselves back to the future without attracting any attention. But they only have enough battery to make it a few days into the future, where Peter is throwing money out of a blimp, and as they are running from the crashing blimp, they hop again to the court case where Peter's sentenced, where they accidentally stop the Kool-Aid Man from making his gag. After buying new batteries and returning to their time, Stewie learns that Brian actually used some of his time in the past to warn his past self about the September 11th terror attacks, and is now a national hero, as well as the fact that this has caused a civil war within the US that, after going 5 years into the future, they've learned has gone nuclear. So Brian and Stewie go back to the past only to learn that Brian and Stewie have gone back to the past to stop Brian and Stewie from going back to the past, and so on, with the massive crowd gathered to vote on whether to change the past or leave it the same, ending when Stewie goes to the original time-traveling couple and threatens them with a gun to stay home rather than finding the tennis ball. Family Guy has undoubtedly changed over the years, and the fact that an episode like this can even exist in the first place is proof of that. It's not merely the cheeky jokes at their own expense, like pointing out animation errors or oversights in the backgrounds, but fundamental things about how the characters behave and the ways in which they react to the reception of their own antics. I especially like the way they compare the family's reactions mid-cutaway, as though they were more professional in the past, and now the characters and thus showrunners are now far more casual when implementing a joke that has nothing to do with the plot. Family Guy knows what type of show it is, and it knows what type of show it used to be, and thus the audience can be comfortable in knowing what type of show it will likely become. But then there's something to be said for looking down on the past, on the episodes that got people hooked on the show in the first place. To take something beloved and then act like it's not worth that attention can be a betrayal of the audience you have formed over the years, and yet this isn't how the episode really comes across. With so many Stewies and Brians appearing after the fact, one can't help but imagine that a decade or so after this episode aired, so about now, they might go back to the pilot, to make the same criticisms of their own work. Not to mention the narrative thread of Brian stopping a terror attack and then the world being worse as a result. It's as if the showrunners are aware of their shortcomings, but if given the chance to do it all over again, would do everything the same way. Be careful what you fish for. Peter hears on the news there are a bunch of Mercedes cars at the bottom of the ocean, so he and the guys rent a boat to get one, only to catch a talking dolphin named Billy Finn, voiced by Ricky Gervais, who offers to retrieve one of the hood ornaments for him. Peter asks if he can repay the dolphin, to which Billy says he can do so by allowing him to stay with the Griffin family for a few days. But a few days turns into weeks, and soon even Peter's frustrated with how much Billy's overstayed his welcome. He learns from Billy that he's only on land in the first place as his wife left him, so he and the other guys go underwater to convince his wife to take him back so they can get their couch back. In the B-plot, Stewie's new daycare is run terribly, so Brian decides to speak to the daycare's owner about the conditions, only to learn that it's run by an attractive woman named Miss Emily. Brian then decides to keep the conditions a secret from Lois, as he's trying to sleep with Emily, who doesn't seem to be aware she's running the daycare poorly. Stewie is disgusted by Brian prioritizing an attractive woman over his well-being, until Brian meets Emily's boyfriend, after which he calls the police. Remember, like, an hour and a half ago when I went on this inexplicable rant about the differences between American and British humor styles, despite the fact that it had very little to do with the actual conflict of the episode? This is the part of the video where I give the context as to why that rant makes sense. About time. Ricky Gervais plays a dolphin who makes bad puns and then awkwardly laughs at his own jokes, while also occasionally describing something funny in a dry and bland way to make it not funny due to the delivery. And at first there's an idea that we're meant to be laughing at the dolphin and not with him, but as the joke stopped being funny partways through, even the Griffin family wants him out. Not merely out of their house, but the whole show. The awkwardness of British humor does not mesh well with the faster, more sardonic takes that Family Guy's known for. So even though they've brought a comedian over for a guest spot, Billy Finn has wound up as one of the most disliked guest appearances on the show due to not being funny. If Family Guy was a different type of show, then perhaps it would have worked, but being the fast-paced cutaway gag-filled romp that it is, pausing for an overly long stint of cringe humor comes across as awkward, just not in the way anyone intended. ylimaF. While trying to flirt with women at a bar, Brian uses his access to Stewie's time machine to win them over, bringing several women home over a few days and taking them to various historical moments. But when he realizes that the time machine has an odometer of sorts, he worries Stewie will find out he's been using it, and he tries to reset the odometer, accidentally creating a shockwave that knocks him and Stewie out. They wake up in a world where time flows backwards, which is really hard to show given the format of this video, and they watch several iconic Family Guy gags play through the consequences first and the actions afterwards. But after a while of suffering through reverse jokes, Stewie starts to realize he's losing his baby teeth and will soon be unborn, no longer existing. He and Brian try to work on repairing the time machine, but Stewie's then taken away to be brought back to the hospital. So Brian has to repair the machine himself, doing the reverse of what he did before. Brian then rushes to the hospital asking if Stewie is okay, and this action is what convinces the family to name their son Stewie. This is another one of those well-regarded episodes of Family Guy that borrows most of its humor and quality from earlier episodes in the series, and the fact that this episode is so beloved despite not being altogether transformative is indicative of something about these cutaways, namely the fact that even the worst episodes of Family Guy will still have a few defenders arguing that the last episode was at the very least funny. Sure, the episode was kind of bad, but remember that one really funny cutaway in it? The quality from episode to episode doesn't actually vary very much, despite having huge potential swings in either direction because of this fact. Each episode of Family Guy is basically the exact sum of its parts. And herein lies how and why Family Guy is remembered, not as a series of episodes or even whole seasons, but for individual gags. Going through this episode's list of most memorable jokes, it's easy to find oneself trying and failing to remember which episode any of these jokes actually came from, merely remembering you'd seen it before. This is also why the video is being edited in such a way that I seldom show screen caps from the exact moments I'm discussing. People don't link cutaway gags to specific episodes, and this is the most natural way to remind the audience about that. Life of Brian. Stewie and Brian are being chased through the streets by an American Indian gang, barely escaping back to the house of that universe's Stewie, so they can go back in time to undo the action of Stewie giving the Indians guns. After they barely make it back to the present, Stewie decides that enough is enough, and he destroys his time machine so he can never risk his life with it again. While at the dump watching it be crushed, he and Brian find a hockey set and decide to play outside for once, enjoying the day until Brian is hit by a car. The family says their goodbyes to him at the veterinarian before hosting a funeral where the town of Quahog mourns him, and Quagmire's there too. To help them get over Brian's death, the family goes to the pound where Peter meets another talking dog, Vinny, and the two soon hit it off. But Stewie doesn't like this new dog as he still misses Brian, but when Vinny opens up about the fact that he recently lost his owner and saw the same pain in the faces of the Griffins, Stewie finally decides to accept the new dog, replacing Brian. And then, 2 episodes later, Stewie uses a Stewie from a Cutaway Gags time machine to go back to undo all of this. Prior to this episode airing, there was a big deal made about Brian's death, that a major character would be killed off from this show to never come back. The fact that Family Guy had done this before gave the rumors enough credibility that people genuinely believed the show would kill off Brian, and he would never come back the same way that less important characters like Diane Simmons or Mr. Weed before did. For such an integral character in Family Guy to be killed off marked a dedication to taking the show in a new direction. Brian had always been the author-tracked character, so perhaps Family Guy was dedicating itself to being a little bit less political. Or at least the takes would shift away from Brian's neoliberalism and more towards whatever Vinny was setting up for. But no such commitment was ever kept. The half-hearted tragedy of Brian's funeral was jarring enough that perhaps this was a good idea if they couldn't even commit to a real send-off to the character who'd been around since before the pilot. Having everyone suddenly grow sullen and openly mourning didn't feel like Family Guy, and optimistically this could have meant the first step towards a show that took itself more seriously, but that it was undone only 2 episodes later means that a more pessimistic takeaway has to be made. This was something done to boost ratings and grab attention. And if all of this sounds familiar, it should. The beginning of Season 3 also made threats that Brian was going to leave, threats that at the time stood to represent an apprehension that the show needed to mature a bit, only to return to form later. Here, done a second time, it comes across as though the writers were just going through the motions of what a shocking episode ought to look like. Fresh air. Chris is trying and failing to get Peter's attention for some father-son time, so Lois suggests he visit Carter Pewterschmidt, who is currently recovering from a broken leg. So Chris spends several days with the man until Carter makes a full recovery, and when he offers to pay Chris for his time, Chris turns down the money. So Carter decides to rewrite his will to make Chris the sole inheritor of his wealth. Peter grows envious of this money that his son has, so he tries sucking up to Chris, only for Chris to merely grow annoyed with his father's attention. Then, Peter gets the idea to marry Chris, and when Chris realizes this means the two will be spending more time together, he accepts. Peter and Chris then go to Vermont, where they start planning various facets of their wedding together. But on the day of the ceremony, Lois rushes in to stop the union by saying Peter's only marrying Chris for the money, and Chris says he knows this fact, and that he only wanted to spend time with his father. Peter realizes that he's been wrong and learns the lesson that it's not okay for a man to marry his own son for money, which he probably should have known already. There is an implication early on in this episode that Chris Griffin gave a hand job to his grandfather. There's a one-off gag that implies that Meg and Chris bathed together that disgusts even Peter. And of course, the main plot of the episode has to do with a father marrying his son, with all the trappings and emotional beats of a story where the moral's about marrying someone for the wrong reasons. Here, it's the whole union that's meant to be off-putting, but it's handled in such a way as to draw an especially uncomfortable reaction from the audience. And I don't mean this in quite as intentional a way as the showrunners likely thought they would have people reacting. Much in the same way that you can laugh with someone versus at someone, you can also be grossed out by them versus with them. One incest joke in an episode is pretty standard for a show with the reputation for being subversive. Two in the same episode might raise a few eyebrows until they realize they're just trying to get a reaction out of you, but having a whole subplot dedicated to a father-son incest bit that tries to mimic the trappings of a different type of episode just feels uninspired, like a lengthy gag that wasn't funny in the first place, and the joke is it keeps going far beyond the point where it would be funny, though in this case, the joke is on the viewer who tries to put up with the show and look for some reason they bothered to go there. Early seasons were edgy for the sake of making a statement. Here, the statement is, look at me. Herpes, the love sore. After watching two characters become blood brothers in an old western, Stewie asks Brian if they can become blood brothers too. They slice open their palms and press their hands together, and then the next morning Stewie wakes up with herpes on his lip. He blames Brian for this, discovering that the dog has herpes and refused to tell him. Chris soon finds out what happened to Stewie, and the two decide to get their revenge by following Brian around and shaming him in front of his dates. Eventually, Brian asks what it is that they want from him, and Stewie confesses he merely felt hurt that, for a moment, he couldn't trust his best friend. Meanwhile, Peter, Joe, and Quagmire have had their booth stolen by a group of men who threaten them when they try to take it back, so the guys back off and let them keep it. For the next several days, people stop treating them with respect as they're branded cowards. Lois eventually has enough of the meek Peter, and she orders him to go fight for his spot, with Peter talking the other men into joining him. The guys get beaten up pretty badly, until the men in their booth decide it's not worth it to keep fighting, as they're about to be deployed anyway, and the whole bar comes together to celebrate the soldiers' sacrifice. This episode's main gimmick is the fact that there are repeated close-ups of herpes-infected skin, with the boils being the joke, I guess. This type of gross-out humor is typically done in small doses as a way to shock the audience, but the audience by this point is effectively desensitized to the shock humor, to the point that it's far more shock than humor. Stewie and Chris spend so much of the episode trying to shame Brian for being gross and having herpes, and then the writers repeatedly shove the herpes in our face as though it's better as long as they are self-aware. It's generally alright to be edgy as long as you're aware you are being edgy. But being self-aware also means you have to be aware of how edgy you are, and this is a point where the writers have come up short. I've mentioned before that Family Guy is a show known for pushing boundaries. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've mentioned before that I've mentioned that before. But the reason it's not so well received has to do with the fact that this edginess doesn't really mean anything anymore. As long as it's more funny than off-putting, then audiences will find it gross, but they'll laugh at their own reaction. Now it's been so overplayed, it's not really worth laughing at, so it's only grossness with no purpose, and this isn't really something people actively seek out. The Simpsons Guy. Peter is complaining about the quality of newspaper comics and decides to write one of his own that gets increasingly popular until a particularly sexist panel he writes gets him in trouble with the woman of Quahog. After a mob forms outside the Griffin household, the family decides they need to get away from Quahog for a while, so they take a road trip. But when they make a pit stop, their car is stolen, and they take shelter in the nearby town of Springfield. That Springfield. With no money, they have no way of buying food, but Homer offers to buy the Griffin family some donuts, and later takes him to the police station. But the Springfield Police Department is useless, so Homer and Peter team up to find the stolen car themselves by putting on a stolen car wash and trying out a few other cartoonish antics. Meanwhile, Stewie has taken a liking to Bart's pranks and wants to be more like him, until he sees Nelson bullying the guy and vows to kidnap him, as well as the rest of Bart's enemies, as a gift for his idol. Meg points out how many awards Lisa has compared to her lack of anything, so Lisa tries to find something Meg is good at, only to learn that Meg is a natural at the saxophone. Brian is stuck walking Santa's little helper, trying to liberate the animal, only to quickly realize that Santa's little helper is a normal dog unlike Brian, and he simply runs away at the first chance. The Griffin's car winds up being returned by Mole Man, who stole it by mistake, and to celebrate having all their stuff back, Peter offers a 6-pack of Pawtucket Patriot to Homer. But Homer says he doesn't like this beer as it's too similar to Duff, even pointing out that Pawtucket is just Duff with a different label. As the sole representative of Pawtucket in Springfield, Peter gets sued by the Duff Brewery, and the judge presiding over the case, Fred Flintstone, finds that although both beers are distinct in their own ways, Family Guy is far too similar of a show to the beers are far too similar to each other, or whatever. Pawtucket is set to shut down, so the Griffin family has to go home to find Peter a new job. Lisa offers Meg her saxophone, only for Peter to throw it out. Stewie unveils the kidnapped enemies list to Bart, only for Bart to freak out by saying Stewie is too unhinged for the two to keep hanging out together. Before they leave, Homer and Peter get into one last argument that results in a fistfight, then a stolen school bus, a Jack Kirby-style nuclear-powered superhero fight, and a crashed alien ship that winds up with the two at the bottom of Springfield Gorge. In the end, they both agree to disagree over who has the better show, and Peter returns home to find out that Pawtucket is going to stay open because it's not like Duff is actually going to enforce the suit. It's a common myth that different shows in similar genres are actually in direct competition with one another. This is the sort of thinking that drives fandom wars, which, while fun in a quirky way like rooting for a sports team, is fundamentally different from the way that the creative minds behind these shows actually think about their relationship. When Family Guy was first getting its start and Seth MacFarlane was interviewing people, he outright told them he wanted people who were familiar with The Simpsons, as it was his major source of inspiration. Most other animated adult comedies, from Bob's Burgers to King of the Hill, have also cited both The Simpsons and Family Guy as inspirations, and the reason we know this is that the creative minds from these shows said so themselves. In fact, some of the staff on Family Guy were previous writers for The Simpsons who had moved over as a means of advancing their career. So when they were storyboarding this episode, it was just a matter of remembering the style they used to use. The allegations of the shows being similar are addressed by the narrative, with Homer and Peter both arguing over who has the better idea, or at least better implementation. The fact that it's Fred Flintstone of all people presiding over the case is proof that the Family Guy writers are aware of the fact that, no, The Simpsons did not invent the animated sitcom, and even the Flintstones could be argued to be derivative of the Honeymooners to the point of infringement. In fact, everyone short of the first caveman to paint on a wall was probably stealing the idea from someone who came before. The fact that all creative fields aren't a constant flurry of lawsuits and hearings is a testament to the fact that these people have a respect for what one another's doing. Let's be honest, if you had a work you were proud of and someone less experienced than you said that you inspired them to make their own, would you be flattered or would you call a lawyer? The fact that the success of one show typically means the success of another is the reason why the rivalries between these two are more often than not just good-natured ribbing. They even make reference to the fact that The Simpsons and Family Guy surrounded Bob's Burgers to help it find ratings, and now, over 10 years later, 2 of those 3 shows are Emmy winners. Not Family Guy. To make a long story short, The Simpsons and Family Guy are very similar shows. The writers of The Simpsons consider these similarities to be flattering. The writers of Family Guy intended for these similarities to be flattering. Regardless of the differences in tone, such as those that make Bart apprehensive of spending more time with Stewie, both teams are aware that it's these differences that really make their shows great, and these are what they focus on. If you want to hear more of my opinions on The Simpsons, I have a brief video I made about it, which should be in a little bubble on the screen about now. Stewie is pregnant. Stewie is upset about how distant Brian has been lately, so he tries to run the idea through the guy to have a child together, despite not really understanding what that means. But Brian ignores Stewie through their dinner, so Stewie decides to simply use some of Brian's DNA to make himself pregnant with a fancy machine. Stewie reveals the pregnancy to Brian, who wants Stewie to get an abortion, though he eventually convinces the dog he's going to keep the child no matter what. After a lot of planning for their kid that Brian gets dragged along on, Stewie eventually gives birth to a litter of deformed half-human puppies. These creatures run the duo ragged as Brian and Stewie start discussing why Stewie had the kids in the first place, only to learn that Brian was only avoiding Stewie as he thought Stewie wanted space. So they drop the kids off at a pet store and forget about them. Meanwhile, Peter and the guys try to make a viral video by referencing other viral videos they've seen, though none of their attempts are successful, and Chris winds up getting popular for a video of him crossing the street. About 3 of the last 4 episodes I've covered have had very similar introductions to this review section. This episode is gross, and it's not really gross to achieve any end. It's not like gross-out humor cannot or should not be done in television. In fact, an animated sitcom is probably the one genre that can most get away with it. I stated very early in the video that any gag that can be done in live action should not be done in a cartoon. And gratuitous violence, or gross-out gags, certainly have an easier time presenting gore and the like as humorous rather than gratuitous. But just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And what this episode shouldn't have done is be the first TV show on a mainstream network to depict a pregnant male toddler. At least I think it's the first show to do that. If it is, I offer a sarcastic congratulations. If not, I don't want to know. The B-plot of this episode partially touches on why it is that Family Guy is facing increasing pressure to push boundaries faster than audiences are willing to put up with them being moved. And that's the fact that cartoons are now competing with the internet, the viral videos on which are going mainstream at a much faster rate and reaching a larger audience. Whatever boundary Family Guy tries to push, some guy on YouTube hit months before the episode aired. Just like the time Family Guy did rickrolling before the internet got to it, Family Guy is now trying to hop on the next big bandwagon before the internet has the chance to do so, or at the very least, trying to get people to put down their phones long enough to watch a cutaway. And they're operating on a time delay of about 1.5 years to air. Trump Guy. Following the previous episode, Peter has gotten a job as the White House press secretary under the Trump administration. The family, especially Meg, are concerned about the move, but Meg's soon able to speak with Ivanka to get a makeover. Meg is then able to speak with the president one-on-one, where Trump uses the moment of privacy to grab her by the place he's known for doing that. Peter doesn't believe Meg when she speaks out about this, saying that it's his job on the line. But when the family sees Trump attempting to assault her a second time, Peter tries to confront him about this, only for Trump to say that his behavior is no different than the jokes on Family Guy. Peter decides it's time to be nicer moving forward, but changes his mind when he's unable to compliment Meg, saying it's not his responsibility to improve, as people can simply change the channel, but they can't change the president. This argument escalates to a chicken fight through the streets of Washington, D.C. that sees 2 stolen planes crash into the Washington Monument. Both men are hanging from the wreckage when they fall, only to be saved by Justin Trudeau, who was in the area. When picking out the 10 lowest rated episodes for this season, I mostly based the list on IMDb reviews, and so this includes episodes like Trump Guy, where the low rating has just as much to do with the semi-topical political satire as it does review bombing from people who didn't like that their favorite celebrity was made fun of. But Family Guy has always made fun of politicians and celebrities alike. In fact, they've often done so with so little distinction between the two that once the lines start to become blurred, an episode like this is practically inevitable. When a reality TV star is able to make his way into the White House, the difference between a pop culture reference and a political dig no longer exists. So we get a lot of political jokes during this episode that are then immediately pointed out as biased by having Brian or Chris or even Putin revealed to have written the joke themselves. It's a fourth wall break that also calls back to 2011, when Seth MacFarlane led the Comedy Central roast of Donald Trump. Many of the gags in this episode are actually just repeats of jokes he made way back then. And that is probably for the best. Since his campaign first started taking ground in early 2016, the media cycle surrounding Trump has moved very quickly. The writers for the show were worried that when they started producing the episode, the scandals and corruption they covered would have been moved on from. There was a year and a half between writing the jokes and the jokes airing. If the news moved so quickly, then poking fun at a member of his inner circle would have been dated before the episode made it to air. Thus, the criticisms were very vaguely about his Russian connections, appearance, and criminal history. Though, as it turns out, even this was a bit too much for his defenders, as this episode still has one of the most polarizing review spreads on most sites. I guess being easily offended is something bipartisan. You can't handle the booth. The Griffin family all get new phones that they spend their time on, missing the world around them, including the church being burnt down by the second coming of Christ. So Lois decides to confiscate all the phones and take the family to a colonial-style village, though Peter fakes an illness to stay home. But while Peter's home alone, he slips and falls on the stairs, getting his head stuck in the baluster. Soon, and somehow, the whole family is stuck in there too, remaining trapped as a robber comes to the house and invites his friends over to have a robber party. After walking off with everything and even stealing Peter's Stuck in the Stairs song, the family uses the virtual assistant on Lois's phone to call a woodworker who turns out to be Quagmire. He and the other guys realize the wood used for the banister is too rare to cut into, so they leave the family there to be put on display at the colonial village. The real episode is about the characters from Family Guy coming in to do a commentary of the previous episode, with Chris laughing at all of his own jokes, while Brian and Stewie argue over how to do an ad-lib and the difference between a banister and a baluster. When an intern comes in and hands the cast their paychecks, Lois realizes that Peter makes more than she does. On top of that, she also learns the only reason he was paid more is because of an old alimony payment he still has to make to this episode's guest star, Sarah Paulson. Lois is furious that Peter never told her about his first wife, and so she storms out after Peter explains that his Stuck in the Stairs song is an extended reference to the Muppets that no one else got. After the commercial break, the voice actors for the characters come in and explain that none of this matters because they're cartoon characters. After doing the character compliments themselves bit twice, the real actors leave and everyone makes up in time for the ending. Like I stated a while back, I chose episodes for this final selection based on what had the lowest and the highest ratings. Then I filtered out anything that aired within the last year due to recency bias and made my selection that way. This episode was one of the lowest rated on the list, and yet, watching it, I actually found it to be one of my favorites. People complained it was too hard to follow the jokes due to effectively being two episodes played at the same time, but as a reviewer, I would watch each one independently of each other, and when viewed that way, it actually works a lot better. There was a point where the commentary Chris Griffin told the audience to pause the video and look up Sarah Paulson right before the joke about the People vs. O.J. Simpson, a movie she was in. The only thing this episode really does wrong is, I believe, not using its premise enough. It should have better encouraged audiences to engage with both plots simultaneously, though I suppose it's difficult to do if, like most people, you only have Family Guy on in the background while doing something else. Kind of like what you're doing with this video, which, by the way, is completely fine. The video doesn't have much of a visual component, so if you're folding laundry right now, you're technically watching the video as intended. After its third season, Family Guy was taken off the air for several years, where the rights to air reruns were tossed around a bit before ending up on Adult Swim. Here, it managed to find an audience, with the high ratings not only saving Family Guy and getting it renewed, but also saving Adult Swim from its own removal as a programming block. Therefore, we can thank Family Guy for giving us The Venture Bros, my personal favorite show of all time. I'm just putting out a potential source of pro-Family Guy bias I might have had going into this project. Anyway, after finding this new audience, the show was brought back, though the tone of these new seasons was a bit different due to the changes in the intervening years. Those alive during the time can likely vouch for the cultural foothold Family Guy had on American teenagers, with evil monkey t-shirts all over the place. The aughts were a dark time for men's fashion. But what is notable about this new audience is that they're teenagers during the aughts. The 80s cultural parodies that made up so much of Family Guy's earlier humor no longer worked as well, due to the audience only having secondhand experience with the subject matter. But more impactful than this was the fact that the pastiche Family Guy was meant to harp on was also something unknown to the younger audience, save for the most culturally attuned, so TV-addicted, kids. They were raised on The Simpsons and Seinfeld and other shows that, although groundbreaking for their time, were now considered the norm, things built upon to the point where they no longer seemed innovative. Basically, the thing that Family Guy was parodying was now alien to its intended audience, which had shifted a generation younger, and so the writers needed to lean into something to stay relevant post-revival. This wound up being more non-sequitur humor, as the cutaways once seen as references were now miscellaneous gags that felt random to a person who did not grow up in the 80s and didn't know what was being made fun of. Likewise, the intervening years saw a surge in the popularity of shows notorious for pushing boundaries, partially thanks to Adult Swim, as I stated earlier in this section. So there was an expectation that Family Guy ought to continue with this trend, and these boundaries, once pushed to make a statement on censorship or to show a more realistic consequence to a cartoonish antic, was now being crossed just for the sake of crossing the line. Family Guy had a reputation for being edgy, but then everyone else started being edgy too. So Family Guy tried to push the boundaries further until that was all it was known for, a far cry from the original parody defining the show's humor. Family Guy was a show with a split identity between pop culture parody and boundary-pushing shock humor. The pop culture parody stopped being relevant, and the shock humor stopped being unique. So Family Guy existed for several years in a state of limbo as a show that didn't exist for any reason but to cynically hold people's attention to sell ad space. But it's not all doom and gloom for the show. Later seasons have shown a marked increase in self-awareness about what Family Guy is and was. Jokes these days often make fun of Family Guy itself, most notably about characters like Brian, who went from a foil to Peter to an author-tracked soapbox device. And these days there are just as many jokes about the fact that Brian is merely pretending to be an intellectual, and that behind it all is the same lowbrow mentality that tries to drag others down to its level to pretend it's better. But now, Family Guy does not pretend to be better than anybody. It knows it's not high-prestige television, and the political tracks have made way for the parody that it was once known for. But this time, the parodist is the subject of its own humor. Family Guy has always been a show known for parodying cultural staples from 2 decades ago. Shows 2 decades ago now include Family Guy. So Family Guy has lost its original identity, and for the longest time this meant it had nothing going for it. But these days, the humor of Family Guy now includes jokes at its own expense, and so, just like in 1999, we can laugh with Family Guy instead of laughing at it, or not laughing at all.